The Austria which was left after the Treaty of Saint-Germain was so weak economically that its life was maintained only by financial aid from the League of Nations and the Western Democratic States. Its area of population had been so reduced that it consisted of little more than the great city of Vienna surrounded by a huge but inadequate suburb. The city, with a population of 2 millions in a country whose population had been reduced from 52 to 6.6 millions, had been the center of a great empire, and now was a burden on a small principality. Moreover, the economic nationalism of the succession states like Czechoslovakia cut this area off from the lower Danube and the Balkans whence it had drawn its food supply in the pre-war period. Worse than this, the city and the surrounding countryside were antithetical in their outlooks on every political, social, or ideological issue. The city was socialist, democratic, anti-clerical if not anti-religious, pacifist, and progressive in the 19th century meaning of the word progress. The country was Catholic if not clerical, ignorant, intolerant, belligerent, and backward. Each area had its own political party, the Christian Socialists in the country and the Social Democrats in the city. These were so evenly balanced that in none of the 5 elections from 1919 to 1930 did the vote polled for either party fall below 35% or rise above 49% of the total vote cast. This meant that the balance of power in Parliament fell to the insignificant minor parties like the Pan-Germans or the Agrarian League. Since these minor groups threw in their lot with the Christian Socialists from 1920 onward, the dichotomy between the city and the country was transformed into a division between the government of the capital city dominated by the Social Democrats and that of the federal government dominated by the Christian Socialists. The Social Democrats, although very radical and Marxist in word, were very democratic and moderate indeed. In control of the whole country from 1918 to 1920, they were able to make peace, to crush out the threat of Bolshevism from Hungary to the east or from Bavaria to the north, to establish an effective democratic constitution with considerable autonomy for the local states formerly provinces and to give the new country a good impetus toward becoming a 20th century welfare state. The measure of their success may be seen in the fact that the Communists never were able to get established after 1919 or to elect a member to Parliament. On the other hand, the Social Democrats were unable to reconcile their desire for union with Germany called Anschluss with the need for financial aid from the Entente powers who opposed this. An agreement between the Pan-Germans and the Christian Socialists to put Anschluss on the shelf and concentrate on getting financial aid from the victorious Entente made it possible to overthrow the coalition cabinet of Michael Mayer in June 1921, and replace it by the Pan-German Christian Socialist Alliance under the Pan-German Johann Schober. In May 1922, this alliance was reversed when the Christian Socialist leader, Monsignor Ignaz Sirpel, a Catholic priest, became Chancellor. Sirpel dominated the federal government of Austria until his death in August 1932, and his policies were carried on after that by his disciples, Dollfuss and Shushnig. Sepal was able to achieve a certain amount of financial reconstruction by wringing international loans from the victorious powers of 1918. He achieved this, in spite of Austria's poor credit status, by insisting that he would be unable to prevent Anschluss if Austria reached a stage of financial collapse. In the meantime, the Social Democrats in control of the city and state of Vienna embarked upon an amazing program of social welfare. The old monarchical system of indirect taxes was replaced by a system of direct taxes which bore heavily on the well-to-do. With an honest, efficient administration and a balanced budget, the living conditions of the poor were transformed. This was especially notable in regard to housing. Before 1914 this had been deplorable. The census of 1917 showed that 73% of all apartments were one room, with over 90% of workers' apartments in this class, and of these, 92% had no sanitary facilities, 95% had no running water, and 77% had no electricity or gas. Many had no outside ventilation. Although this one room was smaller than 12 feet by 15 feet in size, 17% had a lodger, usually sharing a bed. As a result of the housing shortage, disease, especially tuberculosis and crime, were rampant, and real estate values rose over 2,500% in the 15 years 1885 to 1900. These economic conditions had been maintained by a very undemocratic political system under which only 83,000 persons, on a property basis, were allowed to vote, and 5,500 of the richest were allowed to choose 1/3 of all seats on the city council. Into this situation the Social Democrats came in 1918. By 1933 they had built almost 60,000 dwellings, mostly in huge apartment houses. These were constructed with hardwood floors, outside windows, gas, electricity, and sanitary facilities. In these large apartment buildings more than half the ground space was left free for parks and playgrounds, and central laundries, kindergartens, libraries, clinics, post offices, and other conveniences were provided. One of the largest of these buildings, the Karl Marx Hof, covered only 18% of its lot, yet held 1,400 apartments with 5,000 inhabitants. These were built so efficiently that the average cost per apartment was only about $1,650 each. Since rent was expected to cover only upkeep and not construction cost which came from taxes, the average rent was less than $2 a month. Thus the poor of Vienna spend only a fraction of their income for rent, less than 3%, compared to 25% in Berlin and about 20% in Vienna before the war. In addition, all kinds of free or cheap medical care, dental care, education, libraries, amusements, sports, school lunches, and maternity care were provided by the city. While this was going on in Vienna, the Christian Socialist pan-German federal government was sinking deeper into corruption. The diversion of public funds to banks and industries controlled by Siepel's supporters was revealed by parliamentary investigations in spite of the government's efforts to conceal the facts. When the federal government struck back with its own investigation of the finances of the city of Vienna, it had to report that they were in admirable condition. All this served to increase the appeal of the Social Democrats throughout Austria, in spite of their anti-religious and materialist orientation. This can be seen from the fact that the socialist electoral vote increased steadily, rising from 35% of the total vote in 1920 to 39.6% in 1923 to 40% in 1927. At the same time, the number of Christian Socialist seats in Parliament fell from 85 in 1920 to 82 in 1903 to 73 in 1927 to 66 in 1930. In 1927 Monsignor Siepel formed a unity list of all the anti-socialist groups he could muster, but he could not turn the tide. The election gave his party only 73 seats compared to 71 for the Social Democrats, 12 for the Pan-Germans, and 9 for the Agrarian League. Accordingly, Siepel embarked on a very dangerous project. He sought to change the Austrian constitution into a presidential dictatorship as the first step on the road to a Habsburg restoration within a corporative fascist state. Since any change in the constitution required a two-thirds vote in a parliament where the Social Democratic opposition held 43% of the seats, Monsignor Siepel sought to break this opposition by encouraging the growth of an armed reactionary militia, the Heimwehr Home Guard. This project failed in 1929, when Siepel's constitutional changes were largely rejected by the parliament. As a result, it became necessary to use illegal methods, a task which was carried out by Siepel's successor, Engelbert Dollfuss, in 1932 to 1934. The Heimwehr first appeared in 1918 to 1919 as bands of armed peasants and soldiers formed on the fringes of Austrian territory to resist incursions of Italians, South Slavs, and Bolsheviks. After this danger passed, it continued in existence as a loose organization of armed reactionary bands, financed at first by the same German army groups which were financing the Nazis in Bavaria at the same time 1919 to 1924. Later these bands were financed by industrialists and bankers as a weapon against the trade unions, and after 1927 by Mussolini as part of his projects of revisionism in the Danube area. At first, these Heimwehr units were fairly independent with their own leaders in different provinces. After 1927 they tended to coalesce, although rivalry between leaders remained bitter. These leaders were members of the Christian Socialist or Pan-German parties and sometimes had Habsburg sympathies. The leaders were Anton Rintland and Walter Pfriemer in Styria, Richard Steidl in Tyrol, Prince Ernst Friediger von Starhemberg in Upper Austria, and Emil Faith in Vienna. The chief of the general staff of the movement as it became unified was a multi-murderer fugitive from German justice, Waldemar Pabst, who had been involved in numerous political murders ordered by the nationalists in Germany in the period 1909–1923. These organizations openly drilled in military formations, made weekly provocative marches into industrial areas of the cities, openly declared their determination to destroy democracy, labor unions, and the socialists and to change the constitution by force, and assaulted and murdered their critics. Siepel's efforts to amend the Constitution by using Heimwehr pressure against the Social Democrats failed in 1929, although he did succeed in increasing the powers of the Christian Democratic President Wilhelm Mikla somewhat. About the same time, Siepel rejected an offer from the Social Democrats to disarm and disband both the Heimwehr and the Social Democratic militia, the Schutzbund. Siepel's tactics alienated his supporters in the Pan-German and Agrarian League so that his party no longer commanded the majority in the chamber. It resigned in September 1930. Using the new constitutional reforms which had been passed the year before, Siepel formed a presidential cabinet, a minority government, of Christian socialists and Heimwehr. For the first time this latter group obtained cabinet posts, and these the most threatening, since Starhemberg became Minister of Interior which controlled the police, and Franz Huber, another Heimwehr leader, became Minister of Justice. This was done in spite of the fact that the Heimwehr had just introduced into its organization an oath which bound its members to reject parliamentary democracy in favor of the one-party, cooperative leadership state. From this point on, the Constitution was steadily violated by the Christian socialists. New elections were called for November 1930. Starhemberg promised Pfriemer that they would carry out a push to prevent the elections, and Starhemberg publicly announced, "Now we are here, and we will not drop the reins, whatever the result of the elections." Chancellor Karl Vaughan, however, was convinced his group would win the elections. Accordingly he vetoed the putsch. Minister of Justice Huber confiscated the papers of the Pan-Germans, the Agrarians, and dissident Christian socialists, as well as of the Social Democrats, during the campaign on the ground that they were Bolshevik. In this confusion of cross purposes the election was held, the last election held in pre-war Austria. The Christian Socialists lost 7 seats, while the Social Democrats gained 1. The former had 66, the latter 72, the Heimwehr had 8, and the Pan-German Agrarian Bloc had 19. The minority Siepel government tamely resigned, replaced by a more moderate Christian socialist government under Otto Ender with Pan-German agrarian support. In June 1931, though Siepel tried again to form a government, he could not obtain sufficient support, and the weak coalitions of moderate Christian socialists and Pan-Germans continued in spite of a Heimwehr revolt led by Pfriemer in September 193. Pfriemer and his followers were brought to trial for treason, and acquitted. No effort was made to collect their arms, and it soon became clear that the Christian Socialist coalition, moved by their own sympathies and fear of Hameware violence, were opening an attack on the Social Democrats and the labor unions. These attacks were intensified after May 1932, when a new cabinet, with Dollfuss as Chancellor and Kurt Schuschnigg as Minister of Justice, took office. This cabinet had only a one-vote majority in the parliament, 83 for and 8 against, and was completely dependent on the 8 Hameware deputies which provided its majority. It would not call an election, because the Christian Socialists knew they would be overwhelmed. Since they were determined to rule, they continued to rule, illegally and eventually unconstitutionally. Although the Nazis in Austria were growing stronger and more violent every day, the Christian Socialist Hameware coalition passed its time destroying the Social Democrats. The Hameware militia would attack the Socialists in the industrial parts of the cities, coming in by train from the rural areas for the purpose, and the Christian Socialist government would then suppress the Social Democrats for these disorders. After one such affair, in October 1932, Dollfuss appointed the Hameware leader, Ernst Faith, as State Secretary, later Minister for Public Security with command of all the police in Austria. This gave the Hameware, with 8 seats in Parliament, 3 seats in the cabinet. Faith at once prohibited all meetings except by the Hameware. From that point on, the police systematically raided and destroyed Social Democrat and labor union property, searching for arms, they said. On March 4, 1933, the Dollfuss government was beaten in Parliament by one vote, 81 to 80. It threw out one vote on the technicality and used the resulting uproar as an excuse to prevent by force any more meetings of Parliament. Dollfuss ruled by decree, using a law of the Habsburg Empire of 1917. This law allowed the government to issue emergency economic decrees during the war if they were approved by Parliament within a stated period subsequently. The Habsburg Empire and the war were both finished, and the decrees of Dollfuss were not concerned with economic matters, nor were they accepted by Parliament within the stated period. But the government used this method to rule for years. The first decrees ended all meetings, censored the press, suspended local elections, created concentration camps, wrecked the finances of the city of Vienna by arbitrary interference with tax collections and expenditures, wrecked the Supreme Constitutional Court to prevent it from reviewing the government's acts, and re-established the death penalty. These decrees were generally enforced only against the Social Democrats and not against either the Nazis or the Hameware, who were reducing the country to chaos. When the socialist mayor of Vienna disbanded the Hameware unit of that city, he was at once overruled by Dollfuss. In May, the Christian Socialist Party conference failed to elect Dollfuss as head of the party. He at once announced that Parliament would never be restored and that all political parties would be absorbed gradually into a single new party, the Fatherland Front. From this time on, Dollfuss and his successor Shushnaji worked little by little to build up a personal dictatorship. This was not easy, as the effort was opposed by the Social Democrats, who insisted on a restoration of the constitution by the Pan-Germans and their Nazi successors, who wanted union with Hitler's Germany, and by the Heimwehr, who were supported by Italy and wanted a fascist state to dominate the Danube area. While Dollfuss continued his attacks on the workers, the Nazis began to attack him and the Heimwehr. The Nazi movement in Austria was under direct orders from Germany and was financed from there. It engaged in wholesale attacks, parades, bombings, and murderous assaults on the government's supporters. In May 1933, Hitler crippled Austria financially by putting the 1,000 mark tax on all German tourists going to Austria. On June 19, Dollfuss outlawed the Nazis, arrested their leaders, and deported Hitler's Inspector General for Austria. The Nazi Party went underground but continued its outrages, especially hundreds of bombings and thousands of acts of vandalism. In June 1933 they tried to murder Steidl and Rindlin, and in October they succeeded in wounding Dollfuss. In the face of these Nazi atrocities, Dollfuss continued his methodical destruction of the socialists. Since 1930, and probably since 1927, Mussolini had been arming Hungary and the Heimwehr in Austria. The Social Democrats, supported by Czechoslovakia and France, opposed this. In January 1933, the Socialist Railway Union revealed that a trainload of 50,000 rifles and 200 machine guns bombs en route from Mussolini to the Heimwehr and to Hungary. In the resulting controversy, a joint Anglo-French note protesting this violation of the peace treaties and ordering the arms to be either returned to Italy or destroyed was rejected by Dollfuss. Instead, Dollfuss made an agreement with Mussolini for support against the Nazis through the Heimwehr and for destroying the socialists in Austria. In March 1933, Dollfuss outlawed the Republican Defense Corps, the militia of the Socialist Party, took the Heimwehr into his cabinet, and ended Parliament. Because the continued agitations of the Nazis in 1933 made necessary more support for Dollfuss from Mussolini and the Heimwehr, the government began to take steps to abolish the socialist movement completely. At the end of January 1934, orders were issued to the Heimwehr, and they began to occupy Union headquarters, socialist buildings, and the city halls of various provincial cities. On February 11, they arrested most of the leaders of the socialist militia, and the following day made a speech to the Heimwehr in which he said, "Chancellor Dollfuss is our man. Tomorrow we shall go to work, and we shall make a thorough job of it." Bloodshed had already occurred in the provinces, and when on February 12 they attacked the workers in Vienna in their union centers, their socialist headquarters, and their apartment houses, full-scale fighting broke out. The government had an overwhelming advantage, using the regular army, as well as the Heimwehr and police, and bringing up field artillery to smash the great apartment houses. By February 12 the fighting was finished. The Socialist Party and their labor unions were outlawed, their newspapers declared illegal, hundreds were dead, thousands were in concentration camps and prisons, thousands more were reduced to economic want. The elective government of Vienna was replaced by a federal commissar. All the workers' welfare, sports, and educational movements were wrecked, and the valuable properties of these organizations had been turned over to more favored organizations such as the Heimwehr and the Catholic groups. Soon afterward, rents were raised in the socialist apartment houses. Tenants were forced to pay for facilities which had previously been free, including garbage collection. Workers were forced, in one way or another, to join the Fatherland Front, and even the socialist workers were forced to seek jobs through the employment exchanges of the Catholic unions. A new constitution was declared, under the Emergency Economic Decree Power of 1917, on April 24, 1934. It changed Austria from a democratic republic to a Christian, German, corporative, federal state. This constitution was both fraudulent and illegal, and Dollfuss's efforts to make it more legal, if not less fraudulent, had the opposite result. Dollfuss had signed a concordat with the Vatican in June 1933. Since the Holy See wanted this agreement to be approved by Parliament, Dollfuss decided to kill several birds with one stone by convoking the rump of the old Parliament to accept this document, to terminate the disrupted session of March 4, 1933, and to accept the 471 decrees he had issued. Since that date, among these decrees was the new Constitution of 1934. Since the government insisted that the old Constitution had never been suspended or even violated, the new one had to be accepted either by a plebiscite or by a two-thirds vote of the old Parliament with at least half its members present. This was done on April 30, 1934, the various acts being accepted by a fraction of the old Parliament. Because the Socialists were prevented from attending, and the Pan-Germans refused to attend, only 76 out of 165 were present, and some of these voted against the acts proposed. The new constitution was of no importance because the government continued to rule by decree, and violated it as it pleased. For example, the decree of June 19, 1934, deprived the courts of their constitutional power to rule on the constitutionality of all the government's acts before July 1, 1934. The corporative aspect of the new constitution was a complete fraud. In many activities no corporations were set up. Where they were set up, members were appointed and not elected as provided in law, and, in any case, they did nothing. Instead, the whole banking and industrial system was filled with all the petty bureaucrats of the Fatherland Front. Because of mismanagement and the World Depression, the banks of Austria collapsed in 1931 to 1933, precipitating the world banking crisis. The Austrian government took over these banks and gradually replaced their personnel, especially Jewish personnel, by party heads. Since the banks controlled about 90% of the country's industrial corporations, these party heads were able to place their friends throughout the economic system. By 1934 almost nothing could be done in the business world without friends in the government, and anything could be done with friends. Such friendship was best obtained by bribery, with the result that periodical payments were being made from business to political figures. Early in 1936 the scandal broke when it was revealed that the Phoenix Insurance Company, of which Vaughan, ex-chancellor and leader of the Christian Socialist Party, was now president, had lost $250 million in gifts and loans corruptly given. The government had to admit this, and published a list of political groups and politicians who had received the total of less than 3 million shillings. This left most of the loss unexplained. It remained unexplained to the end. Legal proceedings were begun against 27 persons, but the Shushnaji government never brought any of them to trial. This corruption spread through the government until finally the point was reached where, as Starhemberg put it, no one knew whom he could trust, and there was justification for harboring the most amazing suspicions. Outrages by the Nazis increased in May and June 1934, to the point where bombings were averaging 15 a day. On July 12, by decree, the government fixed the death penalty for such bombings. The Nazis threatened the putsch at the first such sentence. This first sentence was carried out on July 24, but against a 22-year-old socialist after a summary trial. The same day the police at the Fatherland Front were notified by their spies that the Nazis were going to attack the next day. All the details were given to Fay, but he and Dollfuss spent the evening discussing a possible socialist uprising. The cabinet meeting of July 25 was postponed because of a warning, but no effort was made to protect the ministers. About 1:00 p.m. 154 Nazis in 8 trucks rushed into the chancellery without a shot being fired. They at once murdered Dollfuss and locked themselves in. Another group of Nazis seized the radio station of Vienna and announced the new government with Hitler as chancellor. There were also sporadic Nazi uprisings in which scores were killed in the provinces. The Nazi Austrian Legion in Germany and the German government did not dare to move because of a stern warning from Mussolini that he would invade Austria from the south if they did. After 6 hours of negotiations in which Fay and the German minister acted as intermediaries, the besieged men in the chancellery were removed to be deported to Germany. When Dollfuss was found to be dead, 13 were executed and a large number imprisoned. All the Nazi organizations were closed and their activities suspended. At the same time, those who had tried to warn the government against the plot to prevent it were arrested and some were killed, including the police spy who had sent the specific details the day before the crime. Shushnaji and the Heimwehr split the government between them after Dollfuss's death. each took 4 seats in the cabinet. Shushnaji was Chancellor in the government and Vice Leader of the Fatherland Front, while Starhemberg was Leader of the Fatherland Front and Vice-Chancellor of the government. From July 1934 on, Shushnaji sought to get rid of the Heimwehr, especially Starhemberg, to create the purely personal dictatorship with only one party, one trade union, and one policy, to satisfy the Nazis without yielding any essential power or positions, to keep the Socialists crushed, and to get as much support from Mussolini as he could. We have said that Dollfuss and Shushnaji were faced by 3 opponents in 193Z, the Socialists, the Nazis, and the Heimwehr. They sought to destroy these in this order by mobilizing against each the power of the ones not yet destroyed, plus the Christian Socialists. As the effort progressed, they tried to destroy the Christian Socialists as well, by driving all groups into a single amorphous and meaningless political party, the Fatherland Front. This party's purpose was to mobilize support for these 2 leaders personally. It had no real political principles and was completely undemocratic, being bound to accept the decisions of the leader. All persons, no matter what their political beliefs, even Nazis, Catholics, Communists, and Socialists, were forced to join by political, social, and economic pressure. The result was that all political morale was destroyed, public integrity was wrecked, and many among the politically active portions of the population were driven to the 2 underground extremist groups, the Nazis and the Communists, to the former in much larger numbers than to the latter. Even the Socialists, in order to prevent the loss of their angry members to the Communists, had to adopt a more revolutionary attitude. Because everything was driven underground, and the field was left to meaningless slogans, crass materialist advantages, and pious expressions of righteousness, no one knew what anyone's real thoughts were or whom they could trust. The loss of Italian support for the Heimwehr and for an independent Austria after the Ethiopian affair made it possible for Shushnaji to get rid of Starhemberg and his militia and made it necessary to conciliate the Nazis. Faye was dropped from the government in October 1935. A political supplement to the Rome Protocols was signed by Austria, Italy, and Hungary on March 3, 1936. It provided that no signer would enter an agreement with a non-signatory state to change the political situation of the Danube area without consultation with the other signers. In April, Austria copied Germany, and further alienated France and the Little Entente, by decreeing the establishment of general military service. In the same month, Shushnaji ordered the disarmament of the Catholic militia. In May 1936, 3 Heimwehr members, including Starhemberg, were dropped from the cabinet, and Starhemberg was removed as leader of the Fatherland Front. A week later, the series of decrees ordered the disarmament of the Heimwehr, created an armed militia for the Fatherland Front as the sole armed militia in the country, ordered that in the future the leader of the front and the Chancellor must be the same person, gave the Chancellor the right to appoint the heads of all local political units and to approve their appointments, prohibited all parades and assemblies until September 30th, and declared that the Fatherland Front was an authoritarian foundation, the legal person, and the sole instrument for the formation of political will in the state. Thus strengthened in Austria, and under pressure from Mussolini to make peace with Hitler, Szuśniewski signed an agreement of July 11, 1936, with Franz von Papen, the German minister. According to the published portion of this agreement, Germany recognized Austrian independence and sovereignty. Each country promised not to interfere in the domestic politics of the other. Austria admitted it was a German state, and additional agreements to relieve the existing tension were promised. In secret agreements made at the same time, Austria promised an amnesty for political prisoners, promised to take Nazis into positions of political responsibility, to allow them the same political rights as other Austrians, and to allow Germans in Austria the same rights to use their national symbols and music as citizens of third states. Both states revoked financial and other restrictions on tourists. Mutual prohibition on each other's newspapers were lifted to the extent that 5 specifically named German papers could enter Austria and 5 named Austrian papers could enter Germany. Other paragraphs promised mutual concessions in regard to economic and cultural relations. Austro-German relations for the next 18 months were dominated by this agreement, Germany, through Papen, trying to extend it bit by bit, while Szuśniewski sought to hold Germany to its recognition of Austrian sovereignty and its promise not to interfere in Austria's domestic political affairs. By the end of that period Germany was insisting that, since the Austrian Nazis were Germans, their desires and activities were not an Austrian, but a German, domestic problem. The secret documents published since 1945 make it quite clear that Germany had no carefully laid plans to annex Austria, and was not encouraging violence by the Nazis in Austria. Instead, every effort was made to restrict the Austrian Nazis to propaganda in order to win places in the cabinet and a gradual peaceful extension of Nazi influence. At the same time, military measures were held in reserve, prepared for use if necessary. To be sure, wild men on the lower levels of the Nazi Party in Germany were encouraging all kinds of violence in Austria, but this was not true of the real leaders. These ordered von Papen to try to get at least 2 years of peace in 1936, and they removed the Austrian Nazi wild men who opposed this from their positions of leadership. In this way the violent Topps plan of the Austrian Nazis was replaced by the Kettler plan of peaceful and gradual penetration through Papen and the Austrian politician Arthur von Seyss in court. The invasion of Austria as early as March 12, 1938, and the immediate annexation of Austria were a pleasant surprise, even for the Nazi leaders in Germany, and arose from several unexpectedly favorable circumstances. Accordingly, the decision to invade was not made before March 1938, and even then was conditional. while the decision to annex was not made until noon on March 12 by Hitler personally and was unknown to both Ribbentrop and Göring as late as 10:30 p.m. on March 12. The circumstances which brought this unexpected speed-up in the German plans were based on two facts: 1. The international situation, and 2. The events in Austria. We shall discuss these in order. As far as obvious political events are concerned, 1937 was the only quiet year after 1933. But the capture and release of various secret documents now make it clear that 1937 was a critical turning point, because in that year the German government and the British government made secret decisions which sealed the fate of Austria and Czechoslovakia and dominated the history of the next 3 years. The decision made by the German government, that is, by Hitler, was to prepare for open military aggression against Czechoslovakia and Austria and to carry this out before 1943 to 1945, probably in 1938. This decision was announced by Hitler to a secret meeting of 7 persons on November 5, 1937. Among those present, besides Hitler and his aide, Colonel Hossbach, were the Minister of War Werner von Blomberg, the Commanders-in-Chief of the Army Werner von Frisch, the Navy Erich Raeder, and the Air Force Hermann Göring, and the Foreign Minister Konstantin von Neurath. It is evident from some of Hitler's statements that he had already received certain information about the secret decisions being made by Chamberlain on the British side. For example, he said flatly that Britain wanted to satisfy the colonial ambitions of Germany by giving it non-British areas like Portuguese Angola, something which we now know was in Chamberlain's mind. Hitler further assured his listeners that almost certainly Britain, and probably France as well, had already tacitly written off the Czechs and were reconciled to the fact that this question would be cleared up in due course by Germany. An attack by France without British support, and with the prospect of the offensive being brought to a standstill on our western fortifications, was hardly probable. Nor was a French march through Belgium and Holland without British support to be expected. Hitler thought that, by reducing German support for Franco in Spain, the war there could be extended, and, by encouraging Italy to stay in Spain, especially in the Balearic Islands, the French African troops could be kept from crossing the Mediterranean Sea for use in Europe, and in general that France and Britain would be so tied down in the Mediterranean by Italy that they would take no action against Germany over Czechoslovakia and Austria. In fact, Hitler was so sure of an Anglo-French war against Italy in 1938 that he was confident Czechoslovakia and Austria could be conquered by Germany in that year. These ideas were completely unacceptable to Blomberg, Frisch, and Neurath. They objected that German rearmament was so backward that they did not have a single motorized division capable of movement, that there was no reason to expect an Anglo-French-Italian war in 1938, that Italy, in such a war, could tie down only 20 French divisions, leaving more than enough to attack Germany, and that such an attack would be very dangerous because Germany's fortifications on her western frontier were insignificant. Hitler brushed these objections aside. He repeated his previous statements that he was convinced of Britain's non-participation, and, therefore, he did not believe in the probability of belligerent action by France against Germany. As a result of the opposition from Blomberg, Fritzsche, and Neurath in this conference of November 1937, Hitler replaced these three by more amenable subordinates in a sudden coup on February 4, 1938. Hitler himself took the posts of Minister of War and Commander-in-Chief, with General Wilhelm Keitel as Chief of Staff for all the armed forces of the Reich. Neurath was replaced in the Foreign Ministry by the fanatical Ribbentrop. The very able Dirksen was sent to London as ambassador, but his ability was wasted, as Ribbentrop paid no attention to his reports and his well-founded warnings. In the meantime, the British government, especially the small group controlling foreign policy, had reached the 7-point decision regarding their attitude toward Germany. 1. Hitler Germany was the front-line bulwark against the spread of communism in Europe. 2. A four-power pact of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany to exclude all Russian influence from Europe was the ultimate aim. Accordingly, Britain had no desire to weaken the Rome-Berlin axis, but regarded it and the Anglo-French Entente as the foundation of a stable Europe. 3. Britain had no objection to German acquisition of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig. 4. Germany must not use force to achieve its aims in Europe, as this would precipitate a war in which Britain would have to intervene because of the pressure of public opinion in Britain and the French system of alliances with Pavians. Germany could get its aims without using force. 5. Britain wanted an agreement with Germany restricting the numbers and the use of bombing planes. 6. Britain was prepared to give Germany colonial areas in South-Central Africa, including the Belgian Congo and Portuguese Angola, if Germany would renounce its desire to recover Tanganyika, which had been taken from Germany in 1919, and if Germany would sign an international agreement to govern these areas with due regard for the rights of the natives, an open-door commercial policy, and under some mechanism of international supervision like the mandates. 7. Britain would use pressure on Czechoslovakia and Poland to negotiate with Germany and to be conciliatory to Germany's desires. To these 7 points we should add an 8th. Britain must rearm in order to maintain its position in a three-bloc world and to deter Germany from using force in creating its bloc in Europe. This point was supported by Chamberlain, who built up the air force which saved Britain in 1940, and by a round-table group led by Lord Lothian, Edward Grigg, and Leopold Amery, who put on a campaign to establish compulsory military service. The first 7 points were reiterated to Germany by various spokesmen from 1937 onward. They are also to be found in many recently published documents, including the captured archives of the German Foreign Ministry, the documents of the British Foreign Office, and various extracts from diaries and other private papers, especially extracts from Neville Chamberlain's diary and his letters to his sister. Among numerous other occasions, these points were covered in the following cases. In a conversation between Lord Halifax and Hitler at Berchtesgaden on November 17, 1938. A letter from Neville Chamberlain to his sister on November 26, 1937. In a conversation between Hitler, Ribbentrop, and the British ambassador, Sir Neville Henderson in Berlin on March 3, 1938. In a series of conversations involving Lord Halifax, Ribbentrop, Sir Thomas Inskip, British Minister of Defence Eric Cord, Ribbentrop's assistant, and Sir Horace Wilson, Chamberlain's personal representative in London on March 10–11, 1938, and in a conference of Neville Chamberlain with various North American journalists held at Lord Astor's house on May 10, 1938. In addition, portions of these 7 points were mentioned or discussed in scores of conversations and documents which are now available. Certain significant features of these should be pointed out. In the first place, in spite of persistent British efforts lasting for more than 2 years, Hitler rejected Angola or the Congo and insisted on the return of the German colonies which had been lost in 1919. During 1939, Germany steadily refused to negotiate on this issue and finally refused even to acknowledge the British efforts to discuss it. In the second place, the British throughout these discussions made a sharp distinction between Germany's aims and Germany's methods. They had no objections to Germany's aims in Europe, but they insisted that Germany must not use force to achieve these aims because of the danger of war. This distinction was accepted by the German professional diplomats and by the German professional soldiers, who were quite willing to obtain Germany's aims by peaceful means. But this distinction was not accepted by the leaders of the Nazi Party, especially Hitler, Ribbentrop, and Himmler, who were too impatient and who wanted to prove to themselves and the world that Germany was powerful enough to take what it wanted without waiting for anybody's permission. These wild men were encouraged in this attitude by their belief that Britain and France were so decadent that they would stand for anything, and by their failure to see a role played by public opinion in England. Convinced that the governing group in England wanted Germany to get Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig, they could not understand why there was such an emphasis on using peaceful methods, and they could not see how British public opinion could force the British government to go to war over the methods used when the British government made it perfectly clear that the last thing that they wanted was a war. This error was based on the fact that these Nazis had no idea of how a democratic government works, had no respect for public opinion or a free press, and were encouraged in their error by the weakness of the British ambassador in Berlin, Henderson, and by Ribbentrop's associations with the Clinton set in England while he had been ambassador there in 1936 to 1938. In the third place, the British government could not publicly admit to its own people these 7 points because they were not acceptable to British public opinion. Accordingly, these points had to remain secret, except for various trial balloons issued through the Times, in speeches in the House of Commons or in Chatham House, in articles in the Round Table, and by calculated indiscretions to prepare the ground for what was being done. In order to persuade the British people to accept these points, one by one, as they were achieved, the British government spread the tale that Germany was armed to the teeth and that the opposition to Germany was insignificant. This propaganda first appeared in the effusions of the Round Table Group, whose leader, Lord Lothian, has visited Hitler in January 1935 and had been pushing this 7-point program in the Times, in the Round Table, at Chatham House and Arley Souls, and with Lord Halifax. In the December 1937 issue of the Round Table, where most of the 7 points which Halifax had just discussed with Hitler were mentioned, the war to prevent Germany's ambitions in Europe was rejected on the grounds that its outcome is uncertain and that it would entail objectionable domestic disasters. In adding up the balance of military forces in such a war, it gave a preponderance to Germany, by omitting both Russia and Czechoslovakia, and by estimating the French army at only 2/3 the size of the German and placing the British army at less than 3 divisions. By the spring of 1938 this completely erroneous view of the situation was being propagated by the government itself. For years before June 1938, the government insisted that British rearming was progressing in a satisfactory fashion. Churchill and others questioned this, and produced figures on German rearmament to prove that Britain's own progress in this field was inadequate. These figures, which were not correct, were denied by the government, and their own rearmament defended. As late as March 1938, Chamberlain said that British armament were such as to make Britain an almost terrifying power on the opinion of the world. But, as the year went on, the government adopted a quite different attitude. In order to persuade public opinion that it was necessary to yield to Germany, the government and its supporters pretended that its armaments were quite inadequate in comparison with Germany. We now know, thanks to the captured papers of the German Ministry of War, that this was a gross exaggeration. From 1936 to the outbreak of war in 1939, German aircraft production was not raised, but averaged 425 planes a month of all types including commercial. Its tank production was low, and even in 1939 was less than Britain's. In the first 9 months of 1939 Germany produced only so tanks a month. In the last 4 months of 1939, in wartime, Germany produced 247 tanks and self-propelled guns, compared to British production of 314 tanks in the same period. At the time of the Munich crisis in 1938, Germany had 35 infantry and 4 motorized divisions, none of them fully manned or equipped. At that time Czechoslovakia could mobilize at least 33 divisions. Moreover, The Czech army was better trained, had far better equipment, and had better morale and better fortifications. At that time Germany's tanks were all below low tons and were armed with machine guns, except for a handful of 18-ton tanks Mark HI armed with a 37 mm gun. The Czechs had hundreds of 38-ton tanks armed with 75 mm cannon. In March 1939, when Germany overran Czechoslovakia, it captured 469 of these superior tanks along with 1,500 planes, 43,000 machine guns, and over 1 million rifles. From every point of view this was little less than Germany had at Munich, and, at Munich, if the British government had desired it, Germany's 39 divisions with the possible assistance of Poland and Hungary would have been opposed by Czechoslovakia's 34 divisions supported by France, Britain, and Russia. Before leaving this subject it should perhaps be mentioned that Germany in 1939 brought into production the Mark IV tank of 23 tons armed with a 75 mm cannon but obtained only 300 of the Mark I and Mark IV together before the outbreak of war in September 1939. In addition, it had obtained by the same date 2,700 of the inferior Mark I and Mark II tanks which suffered breakdowns of as much as 25% a week. At this same date, September 1939, Germany had an air force of 1,000 bombers and 1,050 fighters. In contrast with this, the British air program of March 1934, which emphasized fighter planes, was to provide a first-line force of 900 planes. This was stepped up, under the urging of Chamberlain, and the program of May 1938 was planned to provide a first-line force of 2,370 planes. This was raised again in 1939. Under it, Britain produced almost 3,000 military planes in 1938 and about 8,000 in 1939 compared to 3,350 combat planes produced in Germany in 1938 and 4,733 in 1939. Moreover, the quality of British planes was superior to that of Germany's. It was this margin which made it possible for Britain to defeat Germany in the Battle of Britain in September 1940. From these facts it is quite clear that Britain did not yield to superior force in 1938, as was stated at the time and has been stated since by many writers, including Winston Churchill, whose war memoirs were written 2 years after the Reichswehr archives were captured. We have evidence that the Chamberlain government knew these facts but consistently gave a contrary impression, and that Lord Halifax went so far in this direction as to call forth protests from the British military attachés in Prague and Paris. The Chamberlain government made it clear to Germany both publicly and privately that they would not oppose Germany's projects. As Sturgeon wrote to Ribbentrop on June 8, 1938, anything which can be got without a shot being fired can count upon the agreement of the British. Accordingly, It was clear that Britain would not oppose the annexation of Austria, although they continued to warn vigorously against any effort to use force. In February 1938, Sir John Simon and Chamberlain announced in the House of Commons that neither the League of Nations nor Great Britain could be expected to support Austrian independence. On February 12, Hitler told Schuschnigg that Lord Halifax agreed with everything Hitler did with respect to Austria and the Sudeten Germans. On March 3, Neville Henderson told Hitler that changes in Europe were acceptable if accomplished without the free play of force, and that he personally had often expressed himself in favor of the Anschluss. Finally, on March 7, when the crisis was at its height, Chamberlain in the House of Commons refused to guarantee Austria or any small nation. This statement was made to the cheers of the government supporters. The following day the Foreign Office sent a message to its missions in Europe in which it stated its inability to guarantee protection to Austria. This made it so clear to Hitler that Britain would not move that his orders to invade Austria also ordered no precautions to be taken by the defense forces on Germany's other frontiers. March 11, 1938. In fact, Hitler was considerably more worried about Italy than he was about Britain and France. In spite of Mussolini's agreement of September 1937 to support Germany's ambitions in Austria in return for German support of his ambitions in the Mediterranean. Although the international stage had been set, the invasion and annexation would not have come about in March had it not been for conditions in Austria, especially Schuschnigg's determination to prevent the execution of the Kerbler plan for Nazi penetration of the Austrian government. As soon as he extended one concession, he took away another, so that the Nazi position became a bitter joke. At last Papen persuaded Schuschnigg to visit Hitler at Berchtesgaden on February 12, 1938. There the Austrian Chancellor was upbraided by an enraged Hitler and forced to sign a new agreement which did much to fulfill the Kerbler plan. Although no ultimatum was given to Schuschnigg, it was made quite clear that if peaceful methods did not work, warlike ones would be used. Schuschnigg promised to appoint Seyss-Inquart, a Nazi, as Minister of Security with unlimited control of the police in Austria, to release from prison and to restore to their positions all Nazis who were being held, including the rebels of July 1934. 3. To exchange 100 army officers with Germany. 4. To permit Nazis in Austria to profess their creed and join the Fatherland Front with the same rights as others. The Nazi Party to remain illegal. In return, Hitler repeated the agreement of July 11, 1936. On his return to Austria, Schuschnigg put these concessions into effect piecemeal without any public statement, but he was still determined to resist. On March 2 he began to negotiate with the long-outlawed socialist groups, and on March 8 he suddenly announced a plebiscite for Sunday, March 13. This plebiscite, as planned, was completely unfair. There was only one question, which asked the voters, Are you for a free and German, independent and social, Christian and united Austria, for peace and work, for the equality of all those who affirm themselves for the people and the fatherland? There were no voting lists. Only yes ballots were to be provided by the government. Anyone wishing to vote no had to provide his own ballot, the same size as the yes ballots, with nothing on it but the word no. The Nazis were outraged. Through ceasing court, Hitler sent an ultimatum that the plebiscite must be postponed and replaced by one in which the opposite point of view, union with Germany, could be expressed as well. As the day passed, March 1st, these German demands were increased. In the afternoon, as the German army was marching toward the frontier, came the demand for Schuschnigg to resign and for Seyss-Inquart to become Chancellor. If an affirmative answer came before 7:30 p.m., the invasion was to be stopped. Schuschnigg resigned, but President Nicholas refused to name Seyss-Inquart Chancellor until 11:00 p.m. By that time the German forces were crossing the border, and their advance could not be stopped. Orders had been given to the Austrians not to resist, and the Germans were generally welcomed. Göring demanded a telegram from Seyss-Inquart asking for German troops to restore order and thus justify the invasion. He never got it, so he wrote one himself. The lack of resistance, the welcome from the Austrians, and the inaction of Italy and the Western powers encouraged the Germans to increase their ambitions. During most of March 12 they were talking about an early withdrawal after the Seyss-Inquart government was established, but the uproarious welcome given Hitler at Linz on that day, the need for such Austrian products as wood, the manpower available in Austria's 500,000 unemployed, the opportunity to plunder the Jews, and the complete lack of opposition decided Hitler to annex Austria. This was done on March 13, and a plebiscite was ordered for April 10 to approve the action. In the meantime, those who had opposed the Nazis were murdered or enslaved. The Jews were plundered and abused, and extravagant honors were paid to the Nazi gangsters who had been disturbing Austria for years. The plebiscite of April 10, under great pressure from the Nazis, showed over 99% of the Germans in favor of the Anschluss. Czechoslovakia was the most prosperous, most democratic, most powerful, and best administered of the states which arose on the ruins of the Habsburg Empire. As created in 1919, this country was shaped like a tadpole and was made up of four main portions. These were, from west to east, Bohemia, Moravia, Slovakia, and Rupenia. It had a population of 15 million, of which 3,400,000 were Germans, 6 million were Czechs, 3 million were Slovaks, 750,000 were Hungarians, 100,000 were Poles, and 500,000 were Ruthenians. In general, these people lived on a higher level of education, culture, economic life, and progressiveness as we moved from east to west, the Germans and Czechs being on a high level, while the Slovaks and Ruthenians were on a lower level. The large number of minorities, and especially the large number of Germans, arose from the need to give the country defensible and viable frontiers. On the northwest, the obvious strategic frontier was along the Sudeten Mountains, and, to secure this, it was necessary to put into Czechoslovakia the large number of Germans on the south side of these mountains. These Germans objected to this, although they had never been part of Germany itself, because they regarded all Slavs as inferior people and because their economic position was threatened. The Sudeten area had been the most industrialized portion of the Habsburg Empire, and found its markets restricted by the new territorial divisions. Moreover, the agrarian reforms of the new republic, while not aimed at the Germans, injured them more than others just because they had formed an upper class. This economic discontent became stronger after the onset of the World Depression in 1929, and especially after Hitler demonstrated that his policies could bring prosperity to Germany. On the other hand, the minorities of Czechoslovakia were the best treated minorities in Europe, and their agitations were noticeable precisely because they were living in a democratic liberal state which gave them freedom to agitate. Among the Germans of the Sudetenland, only part were Nazis, but these were noisy, well organized, and financed from Berlin. Their numbers grew steadily, especially after the Austrian Anschluss. The Nazi Party in Czechoslovakia was banned in 1934 but, under Konrad Henlein, merely changed its name to the Sudeten German Party. With 600,000 members, it polled 1,200,000 votes in the election of May 1935 and obtained 44 seats in the parliament, only one less than the largest party. As soon as Edward Beneš succeeded Thomas Masaryk as President of Czechoslovakia in 1935, he took steps to conciliate the Sudetens, offering them, for example, places in the administration proportionate to their percentage of the total population. This was not acceptable to the Germans because it would have given them only 1/5 of the places in their own area, where they were over 90% of the population, as well as 1/5 in Slovakia, where they had no interest at all. In 1937 the Prime Minister, Milan Hoxha, offered to transfer all the Germans in the national administration to the Sudeten areas and to train others until the whole bureaucracy in these areas was German. None of these suggestions was acceptable to Konrad Henlein for the simple reason that he wanted no concessions within Czechoslovakia, however extensive. His real desire was to destroy the Czechoslovak state. Since he could not admit this publicly, although he did admit it in his letters to Hitler in 1937, he had to continue to negotiate, raising his demands as the government made larger concessions. These concessions were a danger to the state because the fortified zones against Germany ran along the mountains and thus right through the Sudetenland. Every concession to the Sudetens thus weakened the country's ability to defend itself against attack. These two facts made all efforts to compromise with England futile from the beginning, and made a constant British pressure on the Czech government to give additional concessions worse than futile. It is worthy to note that no public demand was made by either England or Germany to detach the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia until after September 12, 1938. Although influential persons in the British government were advocating this, both in public and private, for months before this date. The Czech strength rested on its army of approximately 33 divisions, which was the best in Europe in quality, the excellent fortification system, and its alliances with France, the Soviet Union, and the Little Entente. The annexation of Austria surrounded Bohemia with German territory on three sides, but its position, from a military point of view, was still strong. The line drawn from Berlin to Vienna would pass by Prague, but the German army could not safely invade Bohemia across its weakly fortified southern frontier with Austria because of the danger of a Czech counterattack from its fortified base into Bavaria. Within 2 weeks of Hitler's annexation of Austria, Britain was moving. It was decided to put pressure on the Czechs to make concessions to the Germans, to encourage France and eventually Germany to do the same, to insist that Germany must not use force to reach the decision, but to have patience enough to allow negotiations to achieve the same result, and to exclude Russia, although it was allied to Czechoslovakia, from the negotiations completely. All this was justified by the arguments that Czechoslovakia, in a war with Germany, would be smashed immediately, that Russia was of no military value whatever and would not honor its alliance with the Czechs anyway, and that Germany would be satisfied if it obtained the Sudetenland and the Polish corridor. All these assumptions were very dubious, but they were assiduously propagated both in public and in private and may, at times, even have convinced the speakers themselves. The group which spread this version of the situation included Chamberlain, Lord Halifax, John Simon, Samuel Hoare, Horace Wilson, the Clyden set, the British ambassador in Berlin Sir Neville Henderson, and the British minister in Prague Basil Newton. To make their aims more appealing, they emphasized the virtues of autonomy and self-determination and the contribution to European peace which would arise if Germany were satisfied and if Czechoslovakia were neutralized like Switzerland and guaranteed like Belgium. By neutralization they meant that Czechoslovakia must renounce its alliances with the Soviet Union and with France. By guaranteed they meant that the rump of Czechoslovakia which was left after the Sudetenland went to Germany would be guaranteed by France and Germany but emphatically not by Britain. How Czechoslovakia could be guaranteed against Germany by France alone after its defences had been destroyed, when it could not, according to Britain, be defended in 1938 when its defences were intact, and when it would be supported by France, the Soviet Union, and Britain, is only one of the numerous British illogicalities displayed in this crisis. Nevertheless, Britain was able to win support for these plans. especially in France, where Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet and Prime Minister Édouard Daladier reluctantly accepted them. In France, fear of war was rampant. Moreover, in France, even more obviously than in England, fear of Bolshevism was a powerful factor, especially in influential circles of the right. The ending of the Soviet alliance, the achievement of a four-power pact, and the termination of Czechoslovakia as a spearhead of Bolshevism in Central Europe had considerable appeal to those conservative circles which regarded the Popular Front government of Leon Blum as a spearhead of Bolshevism in France itself. To this group, as to a less vociferous group in Britain, even victory over Hitler in war to save Czechoslovakia would have been a defeat for their aims, not so much because they disliked democracy and admired authoritarian reaction, which was true, as because they were convinced that the defeat of Hitler would expose all of Central, and perhaps Western, Europe to Bolshevism and chaos. The slogan of these people, "Better Hitler than Blum," became increasingly prevalent in the course of 1938, and, although nothing quite like this was heard in Britain, the idea behind it was not absent from that country. In this dilemma, the three-block world of the Clyden set, or even the German-Soviet war of the Bolsheviks, seemed to be the only solution. Because both required the elimination of Czechoslovakia from the European power system, Czechoslovakia was eliminated with the help of German aggression, French indecision and war weariness, and British public appeasement and merciless secret pressure. There is no need to follow the interminable negotiations between Hemlin and the Czech government, negotiations in which Britain took an active role from March 1938 to the end. Plan after plan for minority rights, economic concessions, cultural and administrative autonomy, and even political federalism were produced by the Czechs, submitted to Britain and Germany, and eventually brushed aside as inadequate by Hemlin. The latter's Carlsbad demands, enunciated on April 24 after Hemlin's conference with Hitler, were extreme. They began with an introduction denouncing the Czechs and the Czechoslovak state, insisting that the country must abandon its foreign policy and cease to be an obstacle to the German drive to the east. They then enumerated 8 demands. Among these we find 1. Complete equality between Czechs and Germans. 2. Recognition of the German group as a corporation with legal personality. 3. Demarcation of the German areas, for full self-government in those areas. 5. Legal protection for citizens outside those areas. 6. Reparation for damages influenced by the Czechs on the Sudetenland since 1918. 7. German officials in German areas. And 8. Full freedom to profess German nationality and German political philosophy. There is here no hint of revision of the frontiers. Yet when, after long weeks of negotiations, the Czech government substantially conceded these points under severe pressure from Britain, Hemlin broke off the negotiations and fled to Germany September 7–12, 1938. As early as March 17, 1938, 5 days after the Anschluss, The Soviet government called for consultations looking toward collective actions to stop aggression and to eliminate the increased danger of the New World slaughter. This was summarily rejected by Lord Halifax. Instead, on March 24, Chamberlain announced in the House of Commons Britain's refusal to pledge aid to the Czechs if they were attacked or to France if it came to their rescue. When the Soviet request was repeated in September 1938, it was ignored. The French Prime Minister and the French Foreign Minister went to London at the end of April and tried to get Britain to agree to three things. 1. Naval conversations aiming to ensure France's ability to transport its African troops to France in a crisis. 2. Economic support for the Little Entente to save them from German economic pressure. And 3. A promise that if Anglo-French pressure on Czechoslovakia resulted in extensive concessions to the Sudetens and Germany then refused these concessions and tried to destroy the Czech state, an Anglo-French guarantee would then be given to Czechoslovakia. The first two of these were postponed and the third was refused. It was also made clear to the French that, in the event of any British-French war against Germany, Britain's contribution to this joint effort would be restricted to the air, since this was the only way in which Britain itself could be attacked, although it might be possible at some time to send 2 divisions to France. When the French tried to obtain assurance that these 2 divisions would be motorized, it was reiterated that these units were not being promised but were merely a possible future contribution and that no assurance could be given that they would be motorized. The violence of these Anglo-French discussions is not reflected in the minutes published by the British government in 1949. The day after they ended, Chamberlain wrote to his sister, "Fortunately the papers have had no hint of how near we came to a break with the French over Czechoslovakia. It is clear from the evidence that Chamberlain was determined to write off the Sudetenland and not to go to war with Germany unless public opinion in England compelled it. In fact, he felt that Germany could impose its will upon Czechoslovakia by economic pressure alone, although he did not go so far as to say, with Sir Neville Henderson and Lord Halifax, that this method could be successful in a short time. If Germany adopted this course, according to Chamberlain, no casus belli would then arise under the terms of the Franco-Czechoslovak Treaty, and Germany would be able to accomplish everything she required without moving a single soldier. If Germany did decide to destroy Czechoslovakia, he did not see how this could be prevented. But he did not believe that Germany wanted to destroy Czechoslovakia. Accordingly, by putting Anglo-French pressure on the Czechs to negotiate, it would be possible to save something of Czechoslovakia and in particular to save the existence of the Czechoslovak state. In any case, he was determined not to go to war over it, because nothing could prevent Germany from achieving immediate victory over the Czechs, and even if the Germans were subsequently defeated after a long war, there was no guarantee that Czechoslovakia could be re-established in its existing form. Chamberlain's point of view, which was the decisive force in this whole crisis, was presented in more positive terms to a group of North American journalists at a luncheon at Lady Astor's house on May 938. He wanted a four-power pact, the exclusion of Russia from Europe, and frontier revisions of Czechoslovakia in favor of Germany. Since these things could not be obtained immediately, he kept up the intense diplomatic pressure on Czechoslovakia to make concessions to the Sudeten Germans. Under French pressure, he also asked Germany what it wanted in this problem, but, until September, obtained no answer, on the grounds that this was a question to be settled by the Sudetens and the Czechs. In the meantime, the German occupation of Austria changed the strategic situation for Germany so that it was necessary for Hitler to modify his general order to the armed forces for operational plans against France, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. These orders had been issued on June 24, 1937. The new directive, as drafted by General Carroll on May 20, 1938, and submitted for Hitler's signature, began, "It is not my intention to smash Czechoslovakia by military action in the immediate future without provocation, unless an unavoidable development of the political conditions within Czechoslovakia forces the issue, or political events in Europe create a particularly favorable opportunity which may perhaps never recur." This draft was entirely rewritten by Hitler and signed on May 30, 1938. Its opening sentence then read, "It is my unalterable decision to smash Czechoslovakia by military action in the near future." It then went on to say that in case of war with Czechoslovakia, whether France intervened or not, all forces would be concentrated on the Czechs in order to achieve an impressive success in the first 3 days. The general strategic plan based on this order provided that forces would be transferred to the French frontier only after a decisive blow against Czechoslovakia. No provision was made for war against the Soviet Union except for naval activity in the Baltic, and all regular forces were to be withdrawn from East Prussia in order to speed up the defeat of the Czechs. X-Day was set for October 1 with deployment of troops to begin on September 28. These orders were so unrealistic that the German military leaders were aghast. They realized that the reality was so different from Hitler's picture of it that Germany would be defeated fairly readily in any war likely to arise over Czechoslovakia. All their efforts to make Hitler see the reality were completely unsuccessful, and as the crisis continued, they became more and more desperate until, by the end of August, they were in a panic. This feeling was shared by the whole foreign ministry except Ribbentrop himself. Hitler was isolated in his mountain retreat, living in a dream world and very short-tempered. He was cut off from outside contacts by Ribbentrop, Himmler, and Hess, who told him that Russia, France, and Britain would not fight and that the Czechs were bluffing. One of the mysteries yet remaining is why Ribbentrop was so sure that Britain would not fight. He was right. The German generals tried to dissuade Hitler from his project, and then they found that they had no influence over him. They persuaded various important people who saw him to intervene for the same purpose. Thus, they were able to get Admiral Miklós Horthy, regent of Hungary, to try to influence the Führer during his visit of August 21, 26, 1938. Hitler interrupted by shouting, "Nonsense! Shut up!" The generals and several important civil leaders then formed a conspiracy led by General Ludwig Beck, chief of the General Staff. All the important generals were in it, including General Erwin Witzleben, governor of Berlin, and General George Thomas, chief of supply. Among the civil leaders were Baron Ernst von Weizsäcker, State Secretary in the Foreign Ministry, Erich Kord, head of Ribbentrop's office, and Ulrich von Hassel, ambassador to Rome, 1932 to 1938. Their plot had 3 stages in it. 1. To exert every effort to make Hitler see the truth. 2. To inform the British of their efforts and beg them to stand firm on the Czechoslovak issue, and to tell the German government that Britain would fight if Hitler made war on Czechoslovakia. 3. To assassinate Hitler if he nevertheless issued the order to attack Czechoslovakia. Although message after message was sent to Britain in the first 2 weeks of September, by Weizsäcker, by Kord, by the generals, and by others in separate missions, the British refused to cooperate. As a result, the plan was made to assassinate Hitler as soon as the attack was ordered. This project was cancelled at noon on September 28, 1938, when news reached Berlin that Chamberlain was going to Munich to yield. The attack order was to have been given by Hitler at 2:00 p.m. that day. In the meantime, the Czechs were negotiating with Konrad Henlein in an effort to reach some compromise less radical than his Carlsbad demands. Pressure was exercised on the Czechs by Britain and France. From May 31 onward, Lord Halifax tried to force France to threaten the Czechs that their alliance would be revoked or at least weakened if they did not make concessions to the Sudetens. This threat was finally made on September 21, 1938. The pressure on the Czechs was greatly increased by the sending of a British mission under Lord Runciman to Czechoslovakia at the beginning of August. This mission was presented to the public as being sent to mediate between Henlein and the government at the request of the Czech government. In fact, it was imposed on the Czech government, and its chief function was to increase the pressure on that government to make concessions. It was publicly announced that the members of this mission went as private persons and that the British government was not bound by anything which they did. Under this pressure, the Czechs yielded little by little and, as already stated, conceded the essence of the Carlsbad demands on September 6. Since the Sudetenlanders did not want any settlement which would not ensure the destruction of Czechoslovakia, they instigated a street riot and broke off negotiations. The official British investigation reported that the riot in question was entirely the fault of the Sudetenlanders who had attacked a policeman. In the meantime, the British had been working out a plan of their own. It involved as we have said, one separation of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, probably through the use of a plebiscite or even by a tripartition, to neutralization of the rest of Czechoslovakia by revising her treaties with Russia and France, and 3. Guarantee of this rump of Czechoslovakia, but not by Britain. This plan was outlined to the Czech ambassador in London by Lord Halifax on May 25, and was worked out in some detail by one of Lord Halifax's subordinates, William now Lord Strang, during a visit to Prague and to Berlin in the following week. This was the plan which was picked up by Lord Runciman and presented as his recommendation in his report of September 21, 938. It is worthy of note that on September and Lord Runciman sent a personal message by Hemlin to Hitler in which he said that he would have a settlement drawn up by September 15. What is, perhaps, surprising is that Lord Runciman made no use whatever of the Carlsbad demands for the extensive concessions to meet them which the Czechs had made during these negotiations, but instead recommended to the British cabinet on September 16, and in his written report 5 days later, the same melange of partition, plebiscites, neutralization, and guarantee which had been in the mind of the British Foreign Office for weeks. It was this plan which was imposed on the Czechs by the Four-Power Conference at Munich on September 30. It was also necessary to impose this plan on the French government and on the public opinion of the world, especially on the public opinion of England. This was done by means of the slowly mounting war scare, which reached the level of absolute panic on September 28. The mounting horror of the relentless German mobilization was built up day by day, while Britain and France ordered the Czechs not to mobilize in order not to provoke Germany. The word was assiduously spread on all sides that Russia was worthless and would not fight, that Britain certainly would not go to war to prevent the Sudetens from exercising the democratic right of self-determination, that Germany could overwhelm the Czechs in a few days and could wipe out Prague, Paris, and London from the air in the first day, that these air attacks would be accompanied by gas attacks on the civilian population from the air, and that, even if Germany could be defeated after years of war, Czechoslovakia would never be reconstructed because it was an artificial monstrosity, an aberration of 1919. We now know that all these statements and rumors were not true. The documentary evidence indicates that the British government knew that they were not true at the time. Germany had 22 partly trained divisions on the Czech frontier, while the Czechs had 17 first-line and 11 other divisions which were superior from every point of view except air support. In addition, they had excellent fortifications and higher morale. These facts were known to the British government. On September 3 the British military attaché in Prague wrote to London that there are no shortcomings in the Czech army, as far as I have been able to observe, which are of sufficient consequence to warrant a belief that it cannot give a good account of itself even fighting alone. In my view, therefore, There is no material reason why they should not put up a really protracted resistance single-handed. It all depends on their morale. The fact that the Germans were going to attack with only 22 divisions was reported to London by the military attaché on September 21. The fact that Russia had at least 97 divisions and over 5,000 planes had been reported by the attaché in Moscow, although he had a very low opinion of both. The fact that Russia sold 36 of their latest model fighting planes to Czechoslovakia was also known. That Russia would fight if France fought was denied at the time, but it is now clear that Russia had assured everyone that it would stand by its treaty obligations. In 1950 it was revealed by President Beneš that Russia had put every pressure on him to resist the German demands in September 1938. Similar pressure was put on France, a fact which was reported to one Don at the time. By the third week of September, Czechoslovakia had 1 million men and 34 divisions under arms. The Germans in the course of September increased their mobilization to 31 and ultimately to 36 divisions. This probably represented a smaller force than that of the Czechs, as many of the 19 first-line divisions were at only two-thirds strength, the other one-third having been used as a nucleus. To form the reserve divisions, of the 19 first-line divisions 3 were armored and 4 were motorized. Only 5 divisions were left on the French frontier in order to overcome Czechoslovakia as quickly as possible. France, which did not completely mobilize, had the Maginot Line completely manned on a war basis, plus more than 20 infantry divisions. Moreover, France had available low motorized divisions. In air power the Germans had a slight edge in average quality, but in numbers of planes it was far inferior. Germany had 1,500 planes while Czechoslovakia had less than 1,000. France and England together had over 1,000. Russia is reported to have had 5,000. Moreover, Russia had about 100 divisions. While these could not be used against Germany, because Poland and Romania would not allow them to pass over their territory, they would have been a threat to persuade Poland to remain neutral and to bring Romania to support Czechoslovakia in keeping the Little Entente intact and thus keeping Hungary neutral. With Poland and Hungary both neutral, there is no doubt that Germany would have been isolated. The neutrality of Poland and Romania would not have prevented the Russian air force from helping Czechoslovakia and, if worse came to worst, Russia could have overrun East Prussia across the Baltic states and from the Baltic Sea, since it had been almost completely denuded of regular German army forces. It is quite clear that Italy would not have fought for Germany. The evidence shows that the Chamberlain government knew these facts but consistently gave a contrary impression. Lord Halifax particularly distorted the facts. Although all reports indicated that the morale of the Czech army was high, he took an isolated sentence from a poorly written report from the British military attaché in Berlin as authority for stating that the morale of the Czechoslovak army was poor and the country would be overrun. although General Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, gave a very encouraging report on the Czech army, and was quoted to this effect by Chamberlain in a cabinet meeting of September 26. Halifax the next day quoted him as saying that the Czech resistance would be of extremely brief duration. The military attaché in Prague protested about the statement in reference to Czech morale, pointing out that it was made in reference to the frontier police, which were not military. The military attaché in Paris questioned Lord Halifax's statement about Gamelin's views, and quoted contrary views from Gamelin's closest associates in the French army. The falsehood that Gamelin was defeatist was spread in the newspapers, and is still widely current. Just when the crisis was reaching the boiling point in September, the British ambassador in Paris reported to London that Colonel Charles Wallenberg had just emerged from Germany with a report that Germany had 8,000 military airplanes and could manufacture 1,500 a month. We now know that Germany had about 1,500 planes, manufactured 280 a month in 1938, and had abandoned all plans to bomb London even in the war because of lack of planes and distance from the target. Wallenberg repeated his tale of woe daily both in Paris and in London during the crisis. The British government began to fit the people of London with gas masks. The Prime Minister and the King called on the people to dig trenches in the parks and squares. School children began to be evacuated from the city. The Czechs were allowed to mobilize on September 24, and 3 days later it was announced that the British fleet was at its war stations. In general, every report or rumor which could add to the panic and defeatism was played up, and everything that might contribute to a strong or a united resistance to Germany was played down. By the middle of September, Bonnet was broken, and Daladier was bending, while the British people were completely confused. By September 27 Daladier had caved in, and so had the British people. In the meantime, on September 13, without consulting his cabinet, Chamberlain asked Hitler by telegraph for an interview. They met on September 15 at Berchtesgaden. Chamberlain tried to reopen at once the discussions toward a general Anglo-German settlement which Halifax had opened in November 1937, but which had been broken off since Neville Henderson's conference with Hitler on March 3. Hitler interrupted to say that he must have self-determination for the Sudeten Germans at once and that the Czech-Soviet treaty must be abolished. If he did not get these, there would be an immediate war. Chamberlain asked to be allowed to return to London to confer with the French and Lord Runciman. The Anglo-French Conference of September 18, 1938, saw the last glimmering of French resistance to Britain's plans, chiefly from Daladier. Chamberlain blamed Beneš for Czechoslovakia's plight, while Lord Halifax repeated all the mistaken arguments about the hopelessness of resistance and the improbability of Czechoslovakia being revived with its present boundaries even after a costly victory. Chamberlain excluded all possible solutions from discussion except partition. To him, the problem was to discover some means of preventing France from being forced into war as a result of her obligations, and at the same time to preserve Czechoslovakia and save as much of that country as was humanly possible. Daladier feebly tried to get the discussion to the real problem: German aggression. Eventually he accepted the British solution of partition of all areas of Czechoslovakia with over 50% Germans, and a guarantee for the rest. As he yielded on the main issue, Daladier tried to get certain concessions: 1. That the Czechs must be consulted. 2. That the rump of Czechoslovakia should be guaranteed by Britain as well as others. 3. That economic aid should be extended to this rump. The last was rejected. The second was accepted on the understanding that Czechoslovakia give up its alliances and generally do what Britain wanted in issues involving war and peace. The first was accepted. The way in which Chamberlain applied consultation with the Czechs before partition was imposed is an interesting example of his mind at work. The British, French, and Czechs were agreed in opposition to the use of a plebiscite in this dispute, although the Entente suggested it to put pressure on the Czechs. Chamberlain said, the idea of territorial cession would be likely to have a more favourable reception from the British public if it could be represented as the choice of the Czechoslovak government themselves, and it could be made clear that they had been offered the choice of a plebiscite or of territorial cession and had preferred the latter. This would dispose of any idea that we were ourselves carving up Czechoslovak territory. He felt it particularly important to show that the Czechoslovak government preferred cession because they were so definitely opposed to a plebiscite that they would fight rather than accept a plebiscite. This Anglo-French decision was presented to the Czechoslovak government at 2:00 a.m. on September 19, to be accepted at once. The terms leaked to the press in Paris the same day. After vigorous protests, the Czechoslovaks rejected the Anglo-French solution and appealed to the procedures of the German-Czechoslovak Arbitration Treaty of 1926. The Czechs argued that they had not been consulted, that their constitution required that their parliament be consulted, that partition would be ineffective in maintaining peace because the minorities would rise again, and that the balance of power in Europe would be destroyed. Bennett refused to believe that new guarantees could be more effective, when Czechoslovakia would be weaker, than those which were now proving inadequate. London and Paris rejected the Czech refusal. Pressure was increased on the Czechs. The French threatened to revoke the French-Czechoslovak alliance and to abandon the whole country to Germany if the Anglo-French solution was not accepted. The British added that the Sudetenland would not be returned to Czechoslovakia even after a successful war against Germany. The British minister in Prague threatened to order all British subjects from the country if he did not receive an immediate acceptance. The Czechoslovak government accepted at 5:00 p.m. on September 21. Lord Halifax at once ordered the Czech police to be withdrawn from the Sudeten districts, and expressed his wish that the German troops move in at once. The next day, September 22, Chamberlain took the Czech acceptance to Hitler at Godesberg on the Rhine. He found the fly-chopper in a vile temper, receiving messages every few minutes about the atrocities being inflicted on the Sudetens by the Czechs. Hitler now demanded self-determination for the Hungarians, Poles, and Slovaks in Czechoslovakia, as well as for the Sudetens. He insisted that he must have the Sudeten areas at once. After that, if the Czechs challenged his choice of a frontier, he would hold a plebiscite and prove how wrong they were. An international commission could supervise the vote. At any rate, he must have the German areas before October 1, for on that day the German forces would move in, war or no war. At Chamberlain's request he embodied his demands in a memorandum which proved to be an ultimatum. This ultimatum was at once carried to Prague to be presented to the Czechs by the British military attaché. Back in London, the cabinet agreed to reject the Godesberg demands and to support France if it had to go to war as a result. The French cabinet also rejected these demands. So did a new Czech cabinet under General January Surový. The Soviet Union explicitly recognized its commitments to Czechoslovakia, and even promised to come to the aid of the Czechs without the necessary preliminary action by France if the case were submitted to the League of Nations. This was to prevent Britain and France from charging Russia with aggression in any action it might take in behalf of Czechoslovakia. On the same day, September 23, Russia warned Poland that it would denounce their non-aggression treaty if Poland attacked Czechoslovakia. Apparently the United Front had been formed against Hitler's aggression, but only apparently. Mr. Chamberlain was already beginning to undermine the unity and resolution of this front, and he now received considerable assistance from Bonnet in Paris. This culminated on September 27 when he made a speech on the radio in which he said, "How horrible, fantastic, incredible is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. A quarrel that has already been settled in principle." The same day he sent the telegram to Beneš that if he did not accept the German demands by 2:00 p.m. the following day, September 28, Czechoslovakia would be overrun by the German army, and nothing could save it. This was immediately followed by another message that in such a case Czechoslovakia could not be reconstituted in its frontiers whatever the outcome of the war. Lastly, he sent another note to Hitler. In this he suggested a four-power conference, and guaranteed that France and Britain would force Czechoslovakia to carry out any agreement if Hitler would only abstain from going to war. At 3:00 p.m. on Wednesday, September 28, Chamberlain met Parliament for the first time during the crisis to inform it of what had been done. The whole city of London was in a panic. The honourable members sat hunched on their benches, waiting for Göring's bombs to come through the roof. As Chamberlain drew to the end of his long speech, a message was brought to him. He announced that it was an invitation to a four-power conference at Munich on Thursday. There was a roar of joy and relief as Chamberlain hurried from the building without any formal ending to the session. At Munich, Hitler, Chamberlain, Mussolini, and Daladier carved up Czechoslovakia without consulting anyone, least of all the Czechs. The conference lasted from 12:30 p.m. on September 28 to 2:30 a.m. when the agreement of the four powers was handed to the Czech minister in Berlin, who had been waiting outside the door for over 10 hours. The agreement reached Prague only 18 hours before the German occupation was to begin. The Munich Agreement provided that certain designated areas of Czechoslovakia would be occupied by the German army in 4 stages from October 1 to October 7. The fifth area, to be designated by an international commission, would be occupied by October 10. No property was to be withdrawn from these areas. The International Commission would order plebiscites which must be held before the end of November, the areas designated being occupied by an international force during the interval. The same International Commission was to supervise the occupation and draw the final frontier. For 6 months the populations concerned would have the right of option into and out of the areas transferred under the supervision of a German Czechoslovak commission. The right of Czechoslovakia was to be guaranteed by France and Britain. Germany and Italy would join this guarantee as soon as the Polish and Hungarian minority problems in that state had been settled. If they were not settled in 3 months, the four powers would meet again to consider the problem. The Munich Agreement was violated on every point in favor of Germany, so that ultimately the German army merely occupied the places it wanted. As a result, the Czech economic system was destroyed, and every important railroad or highway was cut or crippled. This was done by the International Commission, consisting of German Secretary of State Weizsäcker and the French, British, Italian, and Czech diplomatic representatives in Berlin. Under dictation of the German General Staff, this group, by a 4-to-1 vote, accepted every German demand and cancelled the plebiscites. In addition, the guarantee of the right of Czechoslovakia was never given, although Poland seized areas in which the majority of the population was not Polish on October 2 and Hungary was given southern Slovakia on November 2. The final frontier with Germany was dictated by Germany alone to the Czechs, the other 3 members of the Commission having withdrawn. Bennett resigned as President of Czechoslovakia under the threat of a German ultimatum on October 5 and was replaced by Emil Hapschot. Slovakia and Rupenia were given complete autonomy at once. The Soviet alliance was ended, and the Communist Party outlawed. The anti-Nazi refugees from the Sudetenland were rounded up by the Prague government and handed over to the Germans to be destroyed. All these events showed very clearly the chief result of Munich: Germany was supreme in Central Europe. and any possibility of curtailing that power either by a joint policy of the Western powers with the Soviet Union and Italy or by finding any openly anti-German resistance in Central Europe itself, was ended. Since this was exactly what Chamberlain and his friends had wanted, they should have been satisfied. Plans for appeasement by Chamberlain and plans for aggression by Hitler did not end with Munich. Within 3 weeks of this agreement, October 21, 1938, Hitler issued orders to his generals to prepare plans to destroy the Rump of Czechoslovakia and to annex Memel from Lithuania. A month later he added Danzig to this list, although he signified his desire to achieve this through a revolutionary action without a war against Poland. This reluctance for war against Poland did not arise from any affection for peace but from the fact that he had not made up his mind whether to attack France or Poland. He was inclined at first to attack westward, and did not change his mind and decide to deal first with Poland until April 1, 1939. The plans to attack France and the Low Countries soon were reported to London and Paris and had a good deal to do with building up the war spirit in those areas. In addition, the Italian demands for territorial concessions from France in November 1938 aroused the fighting spirit of that country from the level to which it had sat in September. Mussolini was seeking his share in the booty of appeasement but lacked the strength to do much more than make a nuisance of himself. His followers staged a great demonstration in the Italian Chamber of Corporations on November 30, 1938, in which there were loud demands for Nice, Corsica, and Tunis from France. In December, the old Laval-Mussolini Agreement of January 1935 was denounced as inadequate, and a violent anti-French campaign was waged in the Italian press. These disturbances were encouraged by Chamberlain when he pointedly announced in the House of Commons on December 12 that Britain was not bound to come to the aid of France or its possessions if they were attacked by Italy. Bonnet at once tried to repair this damage by asking Chamberlain to make a reference to the fact that Italy had bound itself to preserve the status quo in the Mediterranean in the Anglo-Italian Trano-Perth Agreement of April 1938. Chamberlain refused. Bonnet at once pointed out to London that France had bound itself on December 4, 1936, to come to the assistance of Britain if it were attacked and that this promise was still completely valid. Nonetheless, it was only on February 6, when Hitler's plans to attack Holland and France almost immediately were reported in London, that Chamberlain could persuade himself to state in Commons that any threat to the vital interests of France, from whatever quarter it came, must evoke the immediate cooperation of this country. The Italian demands on France had two important results. The fighting spirits of the French people were revived by being threatened by such a weak power as Italy, and Bonnet was driven to a new appeasement of Germany. On December 6, Ribbentrop came to Paris, signed a treaty of friendship and neutrality, and opened a series of economic discussions. On this occasion the German foreign minister received from Bonnet the impression that France would give Germany a free hand in Eastern Europe. French fears that Britain would seek to detach Mussolini from Hitler by making concessions to Italy at the expense of France did not end until February 1939, and reached their peak in January, when Chamberlain and Halifax made a formal visit to Rome to recognize the King of Italy as Emperor of Ethiopia. This had been agreed between the two powers in the Chano-Perth Agreement of April 1938, and was carried into effect in November, although the conditions originally set by Britain, the withdrawal of Italian troops from Spain, had not been fulfilled. Before Hitler could carry on any further aggressions, he had to dispose of the carcass of Czechoslovakia. He and Ribbentrop were outraged that they had been cheated out of the war in September, and immediately made up their minds to wipe the rest of Czechoslovakia off the map as soon as possible and proceed to a war. "The next time," said Hitler, he hoped no dirty pig would suggest a conference. Orders to plan an invasion of the rump of Czechoslovakia were issued on October 21, as we have said. Carroll's plans, presented on December 17, provided that the task would be done by the peacetime army without mobilization. Any possibility of opposition from Britain or France was effectively disposed of by Lord Halifax's insistence that the guarantee to Czechoslovakia be worded so as to be binding on all four of the Munich powers jointly, or at least on three of them, and would not be accepted by Britain. If worded in such a way as to bind the signers individually, this made any guarantee meaningless, and this distasteful project was indefinitely postponed by a German note to Lord Halifax on March 3, 1939. By this last date Hitler was ready to strike at the rump of Czechoslovakia. Hungary was invited to join in this operation, and eagerly accepted on March 13. In the meantime the projected victim was a nest of intrigue. Sudeten Nazis were everywhere, seeking to make trouble. Poland and Hungary were working to get a common frontier by obtaining Slovakia as a protectorate for Poland and Ruthenia as a province of Hungary. They hoped in this way to block Germany's movement to the east and to keep Russian influence out of Central Europe. Within the two autonomous provinces, Slovakia and Ruthenia, and to a much lesser degree in Bohemia-Moravia, there was turmoil as various reactionary and semi-fascist groups angled for power and German favor. The degree of political maturity in Slovakia may be judged from the fact that the members of Monsignor Tisso's cabinet personally took bombs from the Nazis to stir up trouble in their own province. Their efforts to break away from Prague completely were hampered by the financial insolvency of Slovakia. When they appealed to Prague for financial assistance on March 9, 1939, President Hacha deposed the Slovak premier and three of his ministers. Seyss-Inquart, accompanied by several German generals, forced the Slovak cabinet to issue the Declaration of Independence from Prague. Tissot, summoned to Hitler's presence in Berlin on March 13, was persuaded to approve this action. The declaration was received with profound apathy by the Slovak people, although the German radio filled the air with stories of riots and disturbances, and various Nazi bands within both Slovakia and Bohemia did their best to make the facts fit this description. On March 14, Hašek, the president of Czechoslovakia, was forced to go to Berlin. Although he was 66 years old, and not in the best of health, Hašek was subjected to a brutal 3-hour-long tongue lashing by Hitler, during which he had to be revived from a fainting spell by an injection administered by Hitler's physician. He was forced to sign documents handing Czechoslovakia over to Hitler and ordering all resistance to the invading German forces to cease. Ruthenia had already proclaimed its independence March 14. Within a week, Bohemia, Moravia and Slovakia were declared German protectorates, and the former was taken within the German economic system. Ruthenia was annexed by Hungary after one day of independence. Europe had not yet recovered from the shock of March when Germany seized Memel from Lithuania on March 22, and Italy obtained its crumb of satisfaction by seizing Albania on April 7. IQ 39. It is usually said that the events of March 1939 revealed Hitler's real nature and real ambitions, and marked the end of appeasement. This is certainly not true as stated. It may have opened the eaves of the average man to the fact that appeasement was merely a kind of slow suicide, and quite incapable of satisfying the appetites of aggressors who were insatiable. It also made clear that Hitler was not really concerned with self-determination or with a desire to bring all Germans back to the Reich. The annexation of territories containing millions of Slavs showed that Hitler's real aim was power and wealth and eventually world domination. Thus, from March onward, it became almost impossible to sell appeasement to the public, especially to the British public, who were sufficiently sturdy and sensible to know when they had had enough. But the British public and the British government were two different things, and it is quite untrue to say that the latter learned Hitler's real ambitions in March 1939 and determined to oppose them. Above all, it is completely wrong to say this of Chamberlain, who, more and more, was running foreign policy as his own personal business. Hitler's real ambitions were quite clear to most men in the government even before Munich, and were made evident to the rest during that crisis, especially by the way in which the German High Command seized hundreds of villages in Czechoslovakia with overwhelming Czech populations and only small German minorities, and did so for strategic and economic reasons in the period October 1 to 10, 1938. But for the members of the government, the real turning point took place in January 1939, when British diplomatic agents in Europe began to bombard London with rumours of a forthcoming attack on the Netherlands and France. At that moment, appeasement in the strict sense ceased. To the government the seizure of Czechoslovakia in March was of little significance except for the shock it gave to British opinion. The government had already written off the Rump of Czechoslovakia completely, a fact which is clear as much from their direct statements as by their refusal to guarantee that Rump, and the attention given to other matters even when the seizure was known as it was after March 1. For example, Lord Halifax sent President Roosevelt a long letter analyzing the international situation on January 4th. It is completely realistic about Hitler's outlook and projects, but Czechoslovakia is not mentioned, neither his appeasement. Nevertheless, concessions to Germany continued. But now parallel with concessions went a real effort to build up a strong front against Hitler for the day when concessions would break down. Moreover, concessions were different after March 17 because now they had to be secret. They had to be secret because public opinion refused any longer to accept any actions resembling appeasement. But they were continued for several reasons. In the first place, British rearmament was slow, and concessions were given to win time. In the second place, the projects of the anti-Bolsheviks and three bloc world supporters demanded continued concessions. In the third place, Chamberlain continued to work to achieve his 7-point settlement with Hitler in the hope that he could suddenly present it to the British electorate as a prelude to a triumphant general election which he planned for the winter of 19,391,940. Of these three causes, the first, to gain time for rearmament, as the least important, although it was the one most readily used to justify secret concessions when they were found out. This is clear from the nature of the concessions. These were frequently such as to strengthen Germany rather than to gain time for Britain. The projects of the anti-Bolsheviks and the three bloc world supporters were too dangerous to admit publicly, but they were sufficiently well known in Berlin to lead to the belief, even in moderate circles, that Britain would never go to war for Poland. For example, Weizsäcker, the German Secretary of State, chided Neville Henderson in June 1939 for abandoning his often repeated statement that England desired to retain the sea. The European continent could be left to Germany. However, these two groups, although still active in 1939, and even in 1940, had not originally envisaged the complete destruction of Czechoslovakia or Poland. They had expected that Hitler would get the Sudetenland, Danzig, and perhaps the Polish corridor, and that he would then be stabilized between the Oceanic Bloc and the Soviet Union, with contact with the latter across the Baltic states. It was expected that a rump Czechoslovakia and a rump Poland would be able to survive between Germany and Russia, as Holland or Switzerland could survive between the Oceanic Bloc and Germany. Moreover, the three bloc world supporters never wanted Hitler to drive southward either to the Adriatic or to the Aegean. Accordingly, although divided in respect to Romania and the Black Sea, they were determined to support Turkey and Greece against both Germany and Italy. As a consequence of these hidden and conflicting forces, The History of International Relations from September 1938 to September 1939 or even later is neither simple nor consistent. In general, the key to everything was the position of Britain, for the aims of the other countries concerned were relatively simple. As a result of the dualistic war, as Lord Halifax's biographer calls it, hierarchic policy of Britain, there were not only two policies but two groups carrying them out. The Foreign Office under Lord Halifax tried to satisfy the public demand for an end to appeasement and the construction of a united front against Germany. Chamberlain, with his own personal group, including Sir Horace Wilson, Sir John Simon, and Sir Samuel Hoare, sought to make secret concessions to Hitler in order to achieve the general Anglo-German settlement on the basis of the 7 points. The one policy was public, the other was secret. Since the Foreign Office knew of both, it tried to build up the peace front against Germany so that it would look sufficiently imposing to satisfy public opinion in England and to drive Hitler to seek his desires by negotiation rather than by force, so that public opinion in England would not force the government to declare a war that they did not want in order to remain in office. This complex plan broke down because Hitler was determined to have the war merely for the personal emotional thrill of wielding great power, while the effort to make a peace front sufficiently collapsible so that it could be cast aside if Hitler either obtained his goals by negotiation or made. The general settlement with Chamberlain merely resulted in making a peace front which was so weak it could neither maintain peace by the threat of force nor win a war when peace was lost. Above all, these involved maneuvers drove the Soviet Union into the arms of Hitler. This complex scheme meant that the British government accepted the events of March 15 except for feeble protests. These were directed less against the deed itself than against the risk of agitating public opinion by the deed. On March 5, Chamberlain told the Commons that he accepted the seizure of Czechoslovakia, and refused to accuse Hitler of bad faith. But 2 days later, when the howls of rage from the British public showed that he had misjudged the electorate, he went to his constituency in Birmingham on March 17 and denounced the seizure. However, nothing was done except to recall Henderson from Berlin for consultations and cancelled a visit to Berlin by the President of the Board of Trade planned for March 17 to 20. The seizure was declared illegal but was recognized in fact at once, and efforts were made to recognize it in law by establishing the British Consulate General accredited to Germany at Prague. Moreover, £6 million in Czech gold reserves in London were turned over to Germany with the puny and untrue excuse that the British government could not give orders to the Bank of England. May 1939. The German acquisition of the Czech gold in London was but one episode in an extensive, and largely secret, plan for economic concessions to Germany. For Chamberlain and his friends, the Czechoslovak crisis of March 1939 was merely an annoying interruption to their efforts to make the general agreement with Germany in terms of the 7 points we have already mentioned. These efforts had been interrupted after March 3, 1938 by the Czechoslovak crisis of that year, but they remained the chief item in Chamberlain's plans, and he tried to get Hitler to discuss these projects when the two leaders came face to face on September 15 STH at Berchtesgaden. Hitler interrupted and turned the discussion at once to the crisis. Again, after the Munich Agreement was signed on September 30, Chamberlain tried to get Der Führer to discuss the general settlement, but he was evaded. This process was continued for a year, Chamberlain and his friends proposing concessions and Hitler either evading or ignoring them. There was a slight change, however, after September 1938. Chamberlain's project was widened to include economic concessions, and the efforts to achieve it became increasingly secret, especially after the events of March 1939. After September 1938, the 7-point project was broadened by adding an 8-point economic support for Germany, especially in exploiting Eastern Europe. The German economic situation was critical at the end of 1938 because of the speed of rearmament, the expense and economic disruption arising from the mobilization of 1938, and the great shortage of foreign exchange, which hampered the importation of necessary commodities. Göring, as commissioner of the fourth-year economic plan, presented these facts at a secret conference on October 14, 1938. In the course of his speech he spoke roughly as follows: "I am faced with unheard of difficulties. The treasury is empty. Industrial capacity is crammed with orders for many years. In spite of these difficulties, I am going to go ahead under all circumstances. Memoranda are no help. I want only positive proposals. If necessary, I am going to convert the economy with brutal methods to achieve the same. The time has come for private enterprise to show if it has a right to continued existence. If it fails, I am going over to state enterprise regardless. I am going to make barbaric use of the full powers given me by the Freiherr. All the aims and plans of the state, the party, and other agencies which are not along this line must be rejected pitilessly. Ideological problems cannot be solved now. There will be time for them later. I warn against making promises to labor which I cannot keep. The desires of the labor front must sink into the background. Industry must be fully converted. An immediate investigation of productive plants is to be started to determine whether they can be converted for armaments or export, or whether they are to be closed down. The problem of the machine tool industry comes first in this. It remains now to decide who is going to carry out this task, the state or self-administered industry. The Entente governments were aware of these German problems, but, instead of seeking to increase them, they sought to alleviate them. When economic and political duress was put by Germany on the countries of southeastern Europe in October and November 1938, Chamberlain defended Germany's right to do so in the House of Commons. no economic support was granted to these countries to help them to resist, except for a loan to Turkey. On the contrary, the British government, through the Federation of British Industries, began to negotiate with Germany to create a complete system of industrial cooperation, with cartels dividing the world's markets and fixing prices for over 50 industrial groups. A coal agreement was signed, at Britain's request, at the end of January 1939, and a general agreement was signed between the Federation of British Industries and the Reichsgruppenindustrie on March 16, 1939. In his speech of January 30, 1939, Hitler had said, "We must export or die." 2 weeks later the British government sent Frank Ashton-Watkins to Berlin to find out, if possible, what roads are still open to economic recovery and reconstruction and might, therefore, be worth pursuing, and what roads are closed. On March 5 he reported that Germany's critical economic situation was caused by its political actions in 1938 and that it must now turn to economic actions for 1939. This, he felt, implies, though it does not necessitate, some limitation of the armaments race. Secondly, it means that Germany must look towards the United Kingdom for assistance or cooperation in the economic sphere. He listed the concessions that the Germans wanted, and concluded, "We should not ignore the possibilities of a more peaceful development, and we should not put Hitler in a position to say that once again he made an offer of cooperation to England and that that offer was pushed aside." Accordingly, the discussions continued and the British government announced that the President of the Board of Trade, Oliver Stanley, would go to Berlin on March 17. The British military attaché in Berlin protested as violently as he dared against this economic appeasement in a letter of February 27, saying, "We can only reduce the speed and scope of the universal armaments race by forcing the reduction of tempo on Germany. Germany is apparently now in dire economic straits. We have not applied the economic screw, Germany has tightened it down herself, and it is surely unsound for us to ease it before Germany has made an effort to do so herself." From the military point of view, concessions made by us to the present regime in Germany are generally to be deplored. The opposition in Germany and our potential allies in a possible war, above all, America, are becoming more and more convinced of our weakness and lack of will or power to stand up to Germany. When the Bohemian crisis broke on March 15, 1939, Chamberlain announced that Oliver Stanley's visit to Berlin that weekend would be postponed but that the economic conversations between the British and German industrial associations were continuing. Public outcry continued so high that on March 28 it was announced that these negotiations were being broken off because of disturbed public opinion. However, on April 2, only 5 days later, the German commercial attaché in London was secretly informed that the British were ready to reopen the discussions. The amazing fact is that the British unilateral guarantee to Poland was given on March 31. exactly halfway between the public breaking off and the secret resumption of the economic negotiations. It should perhaps be mentioned that France throughout this period was also negotiating trade agreements to send raw materials to Germany as a result of a preliminary agreement signed during Ribbentrop's visit to Paris early in December 1938. Although the documentation is not complete, we know that this French-German agreement was in final draft by March 11. In spite of these concessions, Hitler was thirsting for war, and replied to every concession with a new bombshell which disturbed British public opinion once more. In November 1938 the Germans engaged in several days of sustained atrocities against the Jews, destroying their property, razing their temples, assaulting their persons, and concluded by imposing on the Jews of Germany a collective fine or assessment of 1 billion Reichsmarks. This was followed by a series of laws excluding the Jews from the economic life of Germany. Public outrage at these actions was still high when, in December 1938, the Germans announced that they were increasing their submarine fleet from 45% to 100% of Britain's, as provided in the Treaty of 1935, and were remodeling to cruisers under construction from 6-inch gun to 8-inch gun vessels. Every effort by Britain to persuade Germany not to do so or even to word their announcement in a way which would allay public opinion was rebuffed by Germany. Finally, in March came the complete destruction of Czechoslovakia. At the same time pressure began to be applied to Poland. Germany opened its negotiations with Poland in a fairly friendly way on October 24, 1938. It asked for Danzig and a strip a kilometer wide across the Polish corridor to provide a highway and for track railroad under German sovereignty. Poland's economic and harbor rights in Danzig were to be guaranteed, and the corridor across the corridor was to be isolated from Polish communication facilities by bridging or tunneling. Germany also wanted Poland to join an anti-Russian bloc. If these three things were granted, Germany was prepared to make certain concessions to Poland, to guarantee the country's existing frontiers, to extend a non-aggression pact of 1934 for 25 years, to guarantee the independence of Slovakia, and to dispose of Ruthenia as Poland wished. These suggestions were generally rejected by Poland. They were repeated by Germany with increased emphasis on March 21. About the same time, the Germans were using pressure on Romania to obtain an economic agreement, which was signed on March 23. On March 17, London received a false report of a German ultimatum to Romania. Lord Halifax lost his head and, without checking his information, sent telegrams to Greece, Turkey, Poland, Bulgaria, and the Soviet Union asking what each country was prepared to do in the event of a German aggression against Romania. For replied by asking London what it was prepared to do, but Moscow suggested an immediate conference in Bucharest of France, Britain, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union to try to form a united front against aggression. March 18, 1939. This was rebuffed by Lord Halifax, who wanted nothing more than an agreement among these states to consult in a crisis, as if they would not do so anyway. Poland was reluctant to sign any agreement involving Russia. However, when news reached London of Hitler's demands on Poland, Britain suddenly issued a unilateral guarantee of the latter state March 3 list. This was extended to Romania and Greece after Italy's attack on Albania April 1–3. The text of Chamberlain's guarantee to Poland is of extreme importance. He said, "Certain consultations are now proceeding with other governments in order to make perfectly clear the position of His Majesty's government in the meantime. Before those consultations are concluded, I now have to inform the House of Commons that during that period, in the event of any action which clearly threatened Polish independence and which the Polish government accordingly considered it vital to resist with their national forces, His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Polish government all support in their power." This was an extraordinary assurance. The British government since 1918 had resolutely refused any bilateral agreement guaranteeing any state in Western Europe. Now they were making the unilateral declaration in which they obtained nothing but in which they guaranteed the state in Eastern Europe, and they were giving that state the responsibility of deciding when that guarantee would take effect. Something quite unprecedented. A little thought will show that all these strange features really stultify the guarantee, and the net result was to leave the situation exactly where it had been before, except that a very severe warning had been conveyed in this fashion to Germany to use negotiation and not force. If Germany used force against Poland, public opinion in Britain would force Britain to declare war whether there was a guarantee or not. The fact that Chamberlain's guarantee was temporary and unilateral left the British free to cancel it when necessary. The fact that it guaranteed Poland's independence and not its territorial integrity left the way open for Germany to get Danzig or the corridor by negotiation, and the fact that it came into effect when Poland wished made it impossible for Britain or British public opinion to refuse to accept any change which Poland worked out in negotiation with Hitler. Most of these points were recognized by the German government. They were pointed out in the Times of April 1 and accepted by Chamberlain. The guarantee was accepted by Bonnet, who, as long ago as November, had said that he wanted to get rid of both the Franco-Polish and the Franco-Soviet alliances. If the chief purpose of the unilateral guarantee to Poland was to frighten Germany, it had precisely the opposite effect. On hearing of it, Hitler made his decision to attack Poland by September 1. Orders to this effect were issued to the German army on April 3, and the plans for Operation White, as it was called, were ready on April 1. On April 28, in a public speech to the Reichstag, Hitler denounced the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 and the German-Polish Non-Aggression Pact of 1934. He also denounced the terms he had offered Poland which had been rejected. As a result, negotiations broke off between the two powers and were never really resumed. Instead, the crisis was intensified by provocative acts on both sides. On May 22 the German-Italian alliance was signed, the Pact of Steel, as Mussolini called it. Here, again, the wording was important. It was a clearly aggressive alliance, since the parties promised to support each other, not against unprovoked attack, as was customary, but in all cases. At the signing, Germany was told flatly that Italy could not make war before 1943 and that the approaching war would be a war of exhaustion. The very next day, May 23, 1939, Hitler held a secret conference with his generals. In the course of a lengthy speech he said, "Danzig is not the subject of this dispute at all. It is a question of expanding our living space in the East and of securing our food supplies, and the settlement of the Baltic problems. Food supplies can be expected only from thinly populated areas. Over and above the natural fertility, thoroughgoing German exploitation will increase production enormously. There is no other possibility in Europe. Beware of gifts of colonial territory. These do not solve the food problem. Remember, blockade. If fate brings us into conflict with the West, possession of extensive areas in the East will be advantageous. We shall be able to expect excellent harvests even less in wartime than in time of peace. The population of these non-German areas will perform no military service and will be available as a source of labor. The Polish problem is inseparable from conflict with the West. Poland sees danger in the German victory in the West and will attempt to rob us of a victory there. There is, therefore, no question of sparing Poland, and we are left with the decision to attack Poland at the first suitable opportunity. We cannot expect a repetition of the Czech affair. There will be war. Our job is to isolate Poland. The success of this isolation will be the decisive factor. Therefore, the flyacopper must reserve the decision to give the final order to attack. There must be no simultaneous conflict with the Western powers France and England. If there were an alliance of France, England, and Russia, I would have to attack England and France with a few annihilating blows. I doubt the possibility of a peaceful settlement with England. We must prepare ourselves for the conflict. England sees in our development the foundation of a hegemony which would weaken England. England is therefore our enemy, and the conflict with England will be a life and death struggle. In the face of this misunderstanding and hatred on the part of Hitler, and in the full knowledge that he had every intention of attacking Poland, Britain made no real effort to build up a peace front, and continued to try to make concessions to Hitler. Although the British unilateral guarantee to Poland was made into a mutual guarantee on April 6, Poland guaranteed Britain's independence in exactly the same terms as Britain had guaranteed that of Poland on March 31. No British-Polish alliance was signed until August 2th. the same day on which Hitler ordered the attack on Poland to begin on August 26. Worse than this, no military agreements were made as to how Britain and Poland would cooperate in war. The British military mission did manage to get to Warsaw on July 19, but it did nothing. Furthermore, economic support to rearm Poland was given late, in inadequate amounts, and in an unworkable form. There was talk of a British loan to Poland of £100 million in May. On August 1, Poland finally got a credit for $8,163,300 at a time when all London was buzzing about a secret loan of £1 billion from Britain to Germany. The effects of such actions on Germany can be seen in the minutes of a secret conference between Hitler and his generals held on August 22. The Führer said, "The following is characteristic of England. Poland wanted a loan from England for rearmament. England, however, gave only a credit to make sure that Poland buys in England, although England cannot deliver. This means that England does not really want to support Poland." Perhaps even more surprising is the fact that France, which had had an alliance with Poland since 1921, had no military conversations with Poland after 1925, except that in August 1936 Poland was given €2 billion as a rearmament loan Rambouillet agreement, and on May 19, 1939, the Polish Minister of War signed an agreement in Paris by which France promised full air support to Poland on the first day of war, local skirmishing by the third day, and a full-scale offensive on the 16th day. On August 23, General Gamelin informed his government that no military support could be given to Poland in the event of war until the spring of 1940, and that a full-scale offensive could not be made by France before 1941 to 1942. Poland was never informed of this change, and seems to have entered the war on September 1 in the belief that a full-scale offensive would be made against Germany in the West during September. The failure to support Poland by binding political, economic, and military obligations in the period before August 23 was probably deliberate, in the hope that this would force Poland to negotiate with Hitler. If so, it was a complete failure. Poland was so encouraged by the British guarantee that it not only refused to make concessions but also prevented the reopening of negotiations by one excuse after another until the last day of peace. This was quite agreeable to Hitler and Ribbentrop. When Count Ciano, the Italian foreign minister, who had been kept completely in the dark by the Germans, visited Ribbentrop on August 1, he asked his host, "What do you want?" "The corridor for dances." "Not any longer." And he fixed on me those cold eyes of his. "We want war." Ciano was shocked, and spent 2 days trying, quite vainly, to persuade Ribbentrop and Hitler that war was impossible for several years. In the light of these facts, the British efforts to reach a settlement with Hitler, and their reluctance to make an alliance with Russia, were very unrealistic. Nevertheless, They continued to exhort the Poles to reopen negotiations with Hitler, and continued to inform the German government that the justice of their claims to Danzig and the corridor were recognized, but that these claims must be fulfilled by peaceful means and that force would inevitably be met by force. On the other hand, they argued, the German agreement to use negotiation would ultimately bring them the possibility of a disarmament agreement, colonial acquisitions, and economic concessions in a settlement with England. The same point of view had been clearly put by Lord Halifax at Chatham House on June 28. The key was no use of force, but negotiations, then a chance to settle the colonial problem, the question of raw materials, trade barriers, Lebensraum, the limitations of armaments, and other issues. This emphasis on methods, with the accompanying neglect of the balance of power, the rights of small nations, or the danger of German hegemony in Europe, was maintained throughout. Moreover, the British continued to emphasize that the controversy was over Danzig, when everyone else knew that Danzig was merely a detail, and an almost indefensible detail. The real issue was Germany's plan to destroy Poland as one more step on the way to the complete domination of Europe. Danzig was no issue on which to fight a world war, but it was an issue on which negotiation was almost mandatory. This may have been why Britain insisted that it was the chief issue. But because it was not the chief issue, Poland refused to negotiate because it feared that if negotiation began it would lead to another unit in which all the powers would join together to partition Poland. Danzig was a poor issue for a war because it was a free city under the supervision of the League of Nations, and, while it was within the Polish customs and under Polish economic control, it was already controlled politically by the local Nazi party under a German Gauleiter, and would at any moment vote to join Germany if Hitler consented. In the midst of all these confusions, the British opened negotiations to get Russia to join the peace front. Although the documents probably never will be published on the Soviet side, the course of the discussions is fairly clear. Both sides thoroughly distrusted each other, and it is highly doubtful if either wanted an agreement except on terms which were unacceptable to the other. Chamberlain was very anti-Bolshevik, and the Russians, who had seen him perform in regard to Ethiopia, Spain, and Czechoslovakia, were not convinced that he had finally decided to stand up to Hitler. In fact, he had not. A few words on this last point are relevant here. We have mentioned that the economic discussions between Britain and Germany, which were publicly broken off on March 28, were secretly reopened 5 days later. We do not know what became of these, but, about July 20, Helmuth Waltat, Reich Commissioner for the 4-year plan, who was in London at an international whaling conference, was approached with an amazing proposition by R.S. Hudson, Secretary to the Department of Overseas Trade. Although Waltat had no powers, he listened to Hudson and later to Sir Horace Wilson, Chamberlain's personal representative, but rejected their suggestion that he meet Chamberlain. Wilson offered one a non-aggression pact with Germany, two a limitation of spheres of interest, three colonial concessions in Africa along the lines already mentioned, for an economic agreement, and five a disarmament agreement. One sentence of Dirkson's report on this matter is significant. It says, Sir Horace Wilson definitely told Harwell that the conclusion of a non-aggression pact would enable Britain to rid herself of her commitments vis-a-vis Poland. One had Chamberlain wanted a non-aggression pact with Germany was stated by him publicly on May 3, only 5 days after Hitler denounced his non-aggression pact with Poland. Dirkson's report of July 21 continued. Sir Horace Wilson further said that it was contemplated holding new elections in Britain this autumn. From the point of view of purely domestic political tactics, it was all one to the government whether the elections were held under the cry "Be ready for a coming war," or under the cry "A lasting understanding with Germany in prospect and achievable." It could obtain the backing of the electors for either of these cries and assure its rule for another 5 years. Naturally, it preferred the peaceful cry. News of these negotiations leaked out, apparently from the French, who wished to break them off, but the rumor was that the discussions were concerned with Chamberlain's efforts to give Germany a loan of £1 billion. This is not supported by the documents. This outcry, however, made it difficult to carry on the discussions, especially as Hitler and Ribbentrop were not interested. But Chamberlain kept Lord Runciman busy training to be the chief economic negotiator in the great settlement he envisaged. On July 29, Cord, the German charge d'affaires in London, had a long talk with Charles Rodenbusten, acting, he believed, on behalf of Chamberlain. It was along the same lines. These offers were repeated in a highly secret conversation between Dirkson and Wilson in the latter's residence on August 3. Wilson wanted a four-power pact, a free hand for Germany in Eastern Europe, a colonial agreement, an economic agreement, and so forth. Dirkson's record of this conversation then reads, after recapitulating his conversation with Waltat, Sir Horace Wilson expatiated at length on the great risk Chamberlain would incur by starting confidential negotiations with the German government. If anything about them were to leak out, there would be a grand scandal and Chamberlain would probably be forced to resign. Dirkson did not see how any binding agreement could be reached under conditions such as this. For example, owing to Hudson's indiscretion, another visit of Herr Waltat to London was out of the question. To this, Wilson suggested that the two emissaries could meet in Switzerland or elsewhere. It was pointed out by Wilson that if Britain could get a non-aggression pact with Germany, it would adopt a non-intervention policy in respect to Greater Germany. This would embrace the Danzig question, for example. It is clear that these negotiations were not the purely personal policy of Chamberlain's but were known to the Foreign Office. For example, On August 9, Lord Halifax repeated much of the political portion of these conversations. After Munich, he said, he had looked forward to 50 years of peace, with Germany the dominant power on the continent, with predominant rights in southeastern Europe, particularly in the field of commercial policy. Britain would engage only in moderate trade in that area. In Western Europe, Britain and France, protected from conflicts with Germany by the lines of fortification on both sides and endeavoring to retain and develop their possessions by defensive means. Friendship with America, friendship with Portugal, Spain for the time being an indefinite factor which for the next few years at least would necessarily have to hold aloof from all combinations of powers. Russia now out of the way, vast and scarcely surveyable territory, Britain bent on safeguarding her Mediterranean communications with the dominions and the Far East. This was three-block world talk straight from All Souls College or Clyden. It was almost impossible to keep negotiations such as these, or rather proposed negotiations, secret. There can be no doubt that rumors about them reached the Russians in July 1939 and, by strengthening their ancient suspicions of Britain, made them decide to avoid any agreement with Britain and to take instead a non-aggression pact offered by Hitler. The outburst of public rage at Russia for doing this by Britain and America now seems singularly inappropriate in view of the fact that the British government was trying to do the same thing at the same time and the fact that France had signed what Russia regarded as a non-aggression pact with Germany on December 6, 1938. Indeed, Sir Neville Henderson, who undoubtedly was more extreme than some of his associates, went so far as to condone an alliance between Britain and Germany. On August 28, 1939, obviously, such an alliance could be aimed only at Russia. The relevant portion of his report to Lord Halifax reads, at the end Herr von Ribbentrop asked me whether I could guarantee that the Prime Minister could carry the country with him in a policy of friendship with Germany. I said there was no possible doubt whatever that he could and would, provided Germany cooperated with him. Herr Hitler asked whether England would be willing to accept an alliance with Germany. I said, speaking personally, I did not exclude such a possibility provided the development of events justified it. The theory that Russia learned of these British approaches to Germany in July 1939 is supported by the fact that the obstacles and delays in the path of a British-Russian agreement were made by Britain from the middle of April to the second week of July, but were made by Russia from the second week in July to the end on August 21. This is supported by other evidence, such as the fact that discussions for a commercial agreement between Germany and Russia, which were broken off on January 30, 1939, were resumed on July 23 and this agreement was signed on August 19. The negotiations for an Anglo-Russian agreement were opened by Britain on April 5, probably with the double purpose of satisfying the demand in Britain and warning Hitler not to use force against Poland. The first British suggestion was that the Soviet Union should give unilateral guarantees to Poland and Romania similar to those given by Britain. The Russians probably regarded this as a trap to get them into a war with Germany in which Britain would do little or nothing or even give aid to Germany. That this last possibility was not completely beyond reality is clear from the fact that Britain did prepare an expeditionary force to attack Russia in March 1940, when Britain was technically at war with Germany but was doing nothing to fight her. The Russians did not reject the British suggestion of April 1939, but agreed to guarantee Poland and Romania if the guarantee were extended to all the states on their western frontier, including Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania, and if it were accompanied by a mutual assistance pact of Britain, France, and Russia, and by a military convention in which each state specified what it would do if the pact came into effect. This offer was a much greater concession than the British seemed to appreciate, since it meant that Russia was guaranteeing its renunciation of all the territory in these 6 states which it had lost to them since 1917. Instead of accepting the offer, the British began to quibble. They refused to guarantee the Baltic states on the ground that these states did not want to be guaranteed, although they had guaranteed Poland on March 31 when Joseph Beck did not want it and had just asked the Soviet Union to guarantee Poland and Romania, neither of whom wanted the Soviet guarantees. When the Russians insisted, the British countered by insisting that Greece, Turkey, Holland, Belgium, and Switzerland must also be guaranteed. In place of the alliance which Russia wanted, to protect itself against having to fight Germany alone, Britain suggested that the Russian guarantee would become valid only if Britain and France took action to fulfill their own guarantee first. France and Russia were both pushing Britain to form a triple alliance, but Britain was reluctant. Churchill and Lloyd George were pushing in the same direction, but Chamberlain fought back on the floor of the House, refusing to help to form or to join any opposing blocs. He also refused to send a cabinet minister to negotiate in Moscow, and refused Eden's offer to go. Instead, he sent William, later Lord Strang, a second-rank Foreign Office official, and only on June 14. Moreover, the British delayed the discussions to the great irritation of the Soviet leaders, although verbally they were always insisting on speed. To show its displeasure, the Soviet Union on May 3 replaced Litvinov with Molotov as foreign minister. This should have been a warning. Litvinov knew the West and was favorable to democracy, to collective security, and to the Western powers. As a Jew, he was anti-Hitler. Molotov was a contrast from every point of view, and could not have been impressed with British sincerity when he had to negotiate with Strang rather than with Halifax or Eden. The conversations continued, with Molotov still insisting on the 3 essentials: 1. Mutual assistance in a triple alliance, 2. Guarantees to all the border states, and 3. Specific obligations as to the amount of assistance by a military convention. On May 19, Chamberlain in Commons refused an alliance between ourselves and other countries, and pointed with satisfaction to that great, virile nation on the borders of Germany, which under this agreement of April 6 is bound to give us all the aid and assistance it can. He was talking about Poland. He seemed not to realize that Poland was much weaker than the Czechoslovakia he had read in 1938, but he should have known better, because the French clearly knew better. Poland, indeed, was opposed to any agreement of the Western powers with the Soviet Union, and refused either to be guaranteed by the latter or to accept military assistance from her, even if attacked by Germany. Poland feared that if Russian troops ever entered the areas which it had taken from Russia in 1920, they could never be persuaded to leave. When Russia suggested in May that the Polish-Romanian alliance of 1926, which was directed exclusively against Russia, should now be extended to oppose Germany as well, Poland refused, although Romania was willing. In the same month, Romania agreed to allow Russian troops to cross the country to oppose Germany if needed, and Romania's position was more delicate than Poland's regarding territories previously taken from Russia, because Russia had never recognized the Romanian acquisition of Bessarabia. On June 6, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland sent a flat refusal to be guaranteed by Russia. The next day Estonia and Latvia signed non-aggression treaties with Germany, and probably secret military agreements as well, since General Franz Hader, the German Chief of Staff, went at once to these countries to inspect their fortifications which were being constructed by Germany. Strang arrived in Moscow only on June 14, almost 2 months after Britain had opened these discussions. By July new difficulties arose because of the Russian insistence on a military convention as an integral part of any treaty. Britain demurred but finally reluctantly agreed to conduct the military negotiations at the same time as the political negotiations. However, the members of the military mission took a slow ship, chartered for the occasion, speed 13 knots, and did not reach Moscow until August 1 lth. They were again negotiators of the second rank, an admiral who had never been on the Admiralty staff, the purely combat army general, and an air marshal who was an outstanding flyer but not a strategist. To negotiate with these three, the Soviet Union named the Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Army, the Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Navy, and the Chief of the Russian General Staff. In London, according to rumor, neither side wanted an agreement, and the military mission had been sent to Moscow to spy out Russia's defenses. From this time on, the obstacles to an agreement were clearly coming from the Russian side, although, considering Chamberlain's secret efforts to make a settlement with Germany, there is no reason to believe that he wanted an agreement with Russia. But perhaps his negotiators in Moscow did. Certainly the French did. From August 10 on, the Russians demanded specific answers, and raised their own demands with every answer. They wanted an exact military commitment as to what forces would be used against Germany in the West so that she would not be free to hurl her whole force against the East. They wanted guarantees whether the states concerned accepted or not. They wanted specific permission to fight across territories, such as Poland, between Russia and Germany. These demands were flatly rejected by Poland on August 19. On the same day, Russia signed the commercial treaty with Germany. 2 days later, France ordered its negotiators to sign the documents offered by Russia, including the right to cross Poland, but the Soviet Union refused to accept this signature until Poland consented as well. On the same day, it was announced that Ribbentrop was coming to Moscow to sign a non-aggression pact. He arrived with a staff of 32 persons in a Condor plane on August 23 and signed the agreement with Molotov late that night. The published portion of the agreement provided that neither signer would take any aggressive action against the other signer or give any support to a third power in such action. The secret protocol, which was added to limited spheres of interest in Eastern Europe. The line followed the northern boundary of Lithuania and the Narev, Vistula, and San rivers in Poland, and Germany gave Russia a free hand in Bessarabia. This agreement was greeted as a stunning surprise in the Entente countries. There was no reason why it should have been, as they had been warned of the possibility on numerous occasions by responsible persons, including Germans like Kort and Weizsäcker. It was also stated that the negotiations leading up to the agreement had been going on for months and that the Anglo-Soviet discussions accordingly were always a blind. The evidence seems to indicate that the first tentative approaches were made in May 1939, and were reported to Paris at once by the French ambassador, Robert Coulondre, from Berlin. These approaches were distrustfully received by both sides and were broken off completely at Hitler's order on June 29. They were reopened by the Germans on July 3. Only on August 15 did Molotov announce his conviction that the Germans were really sincere, and the negotiations proceeded rapidly from that point. While it is untrue to say that the German-Soviet non-aggression pact made the war inevitable, it certainly made it possible for Hitler to start his war with an easier mind. On August 25 he gave the order to attack on August 26, but cancelled it within a few hours, as word arrived that the British had signed an alliance with Poland that same day. Now began a week of complete chaos in which scores of people ran about Europe trying to avoid the war or to make it more favourable to their side. The British begged the Poles and the Germans to negotiate. The Italians tried to arrange another four-power conference. Various outsiders issued public and private appeals for peace. Secret emissaries flew back and forth between London and Germany. All this was in vain, because Hitler was determined on war. Most of his attention in the last few days was devoted to manufacturing incidents to justify his approaching attack. Political prisoners were taken from concentration camps, dressed in German uniforms, and killed on the Polish frontier as evidence of Polish aggression. A fraudulent ultimatum with 16 superficially reasonable demands on Poland was drawn up by Ribbentrop and presented to the British ambassador when the time limit had already elapsed. It was not presented to the Poles, perhaps because they were so afraid of a second Munich that they hardly dared to talk with anyone. Indeed, the Polish ambassador in Berlin had been ordered by Beck not to accept any document from the Germans. The German invasion of Poland at 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, did not by any means end the negotiations to make peace, nor, for that matter, did the complete collapse of Polish resistance on September 16 to 17. Since these efforts were futile, little need be said of them except that France and Britain did not declare war on Germany until more than 2 days had elapsed. During this time no ultimatums were sent to Germany, but she was begged to withdraw her forces from Poland and open negotiations. While Poland shuddered under the impact of the first blitzkrieg, British public opinion began to grumble, and even the government's supporters in Parliament became restive. Finally, at 9:00 a.m. on September 3, Henderson presented to Schmidt, Hitler's interpreter, an ultimatum which expired at 11:00 a.m. In a similar fashion France entered the war at 6:00 p.m. on September 3,